The story begins with the protagonist, Vikir van Baskerville of the Baskerville family, with his head bowed beneath the blade of a guillotine. He had once been a loyal hound to the family, but was sentenced to death on false charges of conspiring with the demon clan. As he faced his end, he vowed that if he were ever to live again, he would no longer live as a hound. Afterwards, Vikir woke up in a cradle, disoriented and confused. He thought he might be in hell, as his surroundings were loud and his body felt heavy. It looked like Vikir was currently at a nursery, as there were many children there, all of them crying. Meanwhile, the Baskerville family patriarch, Hugo le Baskerville, was inspecting the children's cradle. He roamed around the room and noticed children crying, and he dismissed them as insignificant and even referred to them as trash. However, when he approached Vikir, he noticed that the child was quieter than the others. Hugo ordered for Vikir to be moved to the cradle of swords, and his attendant obeyed without question. As Vikir lay in the cradle, he looked up at Hugo with pure hatred in his eyes. He knew that Hugo was the main culprit behind his false charges and subsequent execution. Vikir realized that he had been regressed to when he was a baby, and that he had lived his past life as a hound for the Baskerville family. Vikir had been born into an illegitimate family and had received training in a poor environment. He had been raised to be a loyal hound, willing to do any dirty work that was required of him in order to make the Baskerville family the best of the 7 families. Vikir had stayed loyal to the family and to Hugo because he had wanted to be acknowledged, but his loyalty had ultimately been repaid with a death sentence. The reason behind his execution was simple: he knew too much. Vikir swore that he would never live that life again and that he would take his revenge. However, with his newborn body, he knew that he couldn't do anything. Being moved to the Cradle of Swords was a good opportunity for Vikir to become stronger. Children born into the Baskerville family had to go through one trial called the Cradle of Swords. They were thrown into a maze of swords, and after going through that, they had to get to the Styx River to be examined for their talent. The Styx River was a legendary river that turned the bodies of children into iron. However, there was a limit to how many children it could affect, so being able to reach it faster was crucial. The only way to reach the Styx River first was to head straight out of the helix-shaped wall of blades, which was no easy feat. As Vikir crawled through the Cradle of Swords maze, he couldn't help but think about his past life. He had been ousted by his siblings and couldn't receive the effect he so desperately needed. But this time, things would be different. He was determined to monopolize the Styx River's blessing for as long as he could. As he made his way through the maze, he suddenly fell into the Styx River. The water seeped deep into his body and bones through his cuts, causing him intense pain. But he knew that he had to endure it for as long as he could. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away from him. Outside the maze, Vikir's attendants were shouting for him to come out. They were worried that he would die if he stayed underwater any longer. But Vikir was determined to hold on for as long as possible. Meanwhile, Hugo watched with expectation in his eyes. He asked the Baskerville family head butler John Barrymore how much time had passed since Vikir had gotten in the river. Barrymore responded that around 7 minutes had passed. Hugo laughed and said that Vikir might die. The attendants looked at him with worry, requesting the patriarch Hugo to save Vikir. Hugo called out to Vikir, telling him that he could come out of the water now. But Vikir was too busy absorbing the Styx River water to pay attention. He thought to himself that he couldn't give up this opportunity so easily. He needed to absorb as much as he could until the very end. But then he started to fall down as water entered his mouth. Despite the danger he was in, Vikir knew that he needed to endure it. He kept repeating to himself, to endure, endure, endure. It looked like Vikir was about to drown, but Hugo pulled him out of the water with a smug smile on his face. He commented on how greedy Vikir was, even drinking the water from the Styx River. He then noticed that Vikir already had teeth, which surprised him. Hugo asked the head butler for Vikir's name, and he learned that it was Vikir van Baskerville. Hugo smirked and said that a very greedy son had been born. Vikir, who was still somewhat conscious, thought to himself that he needed to use this time to sharpen his canines in secret. He was determined to rip his master's head off when the time came, and he would do it with his own hands. The Baskerville family would disappear into history too by his own hands. Vikir van Baskerville was born as the bastard son of Hugo le Baskerville, a renowned nobleman of his time. At the tender age of 8, it was apparent that Vikir possessed an extraordinary intelligence that far surpassed his peers. However, within the Baskerville family, he was considered nothing but ordinary, as he did not possess the direct lineage of the family's prominent bloodline. As Vikir grew older, he began to explore different fields of interest, eventually settling on the treacherous paths of assassination, espionage, and conquest. By the time he had reached the age of 20, he had already embarked on several missions that showcased his impressive skill set. But despite his achievements, Vikir still felt inadequate in comparison to those of direct lineage. At the age of 30, the gate leading to the demonic realm had opened, signaling the beginning of a terrifying invasion by the demon clans. Vikir, now a seasoned warrior, stepped up to defend his realm, engaging in battles that saw him slaughter monsters left and right. For the next 5 years, Vikir endured through the era of destruction, fighting tirelessly to protect his people. And when the long war finally came to an end, it was the humans who emerged victorious. For his unwavering loyalty and bravery, Vikir was rewarded by the kingdom. However, the reward he received was not what he expected. Instead of being praised and celebrated for his efforts, he was met with defamatory accusations and false allegations. These unfounded claims led to Vikir's eventual execution by the guillotine's blade. Vikir sat up on his bed, realizing that he was in a nursery. He looked around and came to the realization that he had successfully absorbed the Styx River. This was a major achievement, and he knew that he now had a better starting point in life than before. Suddenly, he heard the door open, and a maid entered the room. The maid seemed surprised and murmured to herself, saying why Madame had asked to place this sort of thing on the bed of the young master Vikir. Vikir was surprised to hear the maid refer to Madame, as he never expected anyone in the Baskerville family to give him, a bastard, a present. The maid left after placing a box in Vikir's bed. As Vikir saw the box opening, he was shocked to see 2 bloody mambas coming out of it. He wondered if Madame had sent them to assassinate him. Vikir knew that there were only a few people in the Baskerville family who would be referred to as Madame, and whoever it was, she was probably trying to reduce competition. As the mambas hissed at Vikir, he realized that they could kill all of the babies in the nursery. However, Vikir caught both the mambas with his bare hands. Filled with hatred, he thought that he would bring the entire Baskerville family down with his own 2 hands. The next day, the people of Baskerville were shocked to find the child sleeping peacefully next to the dead vipers. All the nannies who had been on shift that night were executed after torture, but the reason for the viper's appearance remained unknown. Only the young hound Vikir knew the truth. 8 years later, Vikir was back in class, listening to his teacher discuss the levels of swordsmanship. The teacher explained that if one cannot yet imbue their sword with mana, they are considered a sword beginner. The next level is the sword expert, where one can infuse the blade with a little bit of mana. When the blade emits mana in liquid-like aura form, it is called sword graduator. Lastly, the level at which the aura is solid and the form can freely be changed is called sword master, which is the highest level of swordsmanship. Upon hearing that Sir Hugo, the strongest of the Baskervilles, was a sword master, all the students present exclaimed in surprise and astonishment. However, Vikir was lost in thought and felt the need to regain the power he had prior to his regression before the coming-of-age ceremony. The teacher noticed Vikir's distracted state and thought highly of him, knowing that he had earned a strong physique by diving in the Styx River for 7 minutes. The teacher believed that Vikir was much more talented than the other students, and that the patriarch would be very happy to know about his progress. As Vikir was lost in thought about how many years he needed to kill Hugo, he didn't notice the triplets giving him an evil look after class. After class was over, they pushed him and started mocking him, calling him a garbage van, and talked about the rumors about him diving in the Styx River and strangling 2 vipers to death when he was just a baby. Vikir recognized the triplets as the ones who had stabbed him in the past when he was running away after the defamation. They were known as Hugo le Baskerville's Trident, and their names were Highborough le Baskerville, Middleborough le Baskerville, and Lowborough le Baskerville, all 9 years old. The triplets continued to taunt Vikir, telling him to stop lying and that they didn't like him. Vikir thought to himself that they were going to be a real pain in the ass in just 10 years, and that it might be a good idea to put them in their place now. As Vikir stood before the triplets, one of them brandished a knife and taunted him with a rumor he had heard, that if you stayed in the Styx River for long enough, your body would become like steel and you would be impervious to injury from blades." The other two triplets eagerly echoed their agreement, while the third gave the order for one of the others to hold Vikir still. The triplet caught Vikir from behind and covered his mouth with one hand and said, "I'll eat my hand if he can endure this for 3 minutes." Vikir was not afraid, and even played along with this cruel game for a moment. The triplets attempted to harm him with the knife. 1 minute passed, 3 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed, but Vikir remained unscathed, and the triplets began to realize that the legend they had heard was true. They grew bored with their game and began to release Vikir. As the triplet holding Vikir released him, he noticed blood on his hand and realized that his finger was missing. Vikir then spat out the triplet's finger from his mouth. The triplet was shocked and asked Vikir what he was doing. With an evil smile on his face, Vikir reminded the triplet of his promise to eat his own hand. Meanwhile, the other two triplets were trying to calm down the situation and suggested that they go to a priest to put the finger back. But Vikir was not interested in that and instead asked who let them go. The triplet then attacked Vikir with a knife, calling him a bastard and reminding him that they were a year older than him. Vikir did not dodge the attack and allowed the knife to stick into him, but to the triplet's surprise, it could not pierce his skin. Vikir twisted the triplet's hand and reminded them that they had forgotten that they were dealing with a Baskerville, where power and talent overcome age. With an evil look on his face, Vikir suggested that they continue playing until the end. The triplets, terrified, looked at each other in shock. Vikir suddenly punched the triplets, knocking him to the ground, while the other two watched in disbelief. The third triplet attacked Vikir in a fit of anger, but he quickly kicked him in the face, sending him crashing down. The room fell silent as the triplets lay there, battered and broken. Vikir stood over them, looking cold and unfeeling. He then told the triplets that they would get better with treatment, but he also made it clear that he wouldn't let them leave the room and they would have to live with the discomfort of their own bodies. However, he would be generous and allow one of them to leave. The triplets were surprised and relieved to hear this, and asked which one could leave. Vikir picked up a knife and threw it in front of the triplets, telling them that they would have to decide for themselves who would leave the room. He then started to leave, but not before turning back and issuing a taunting remark saying that he can't wait long, so decide quickly. At least one of you should live right. The triplets looked at the knife and then at each other, realizing that survival was their only option. They began to fight, each trying to grab the knife and gain the upper hand. The sounds of their struggle echoed through the room, and Vikir listened with satisfaction from outside. He had successfully caused the Triton of Baskerville to split, pitting brother against brother in a fight for survival. In the Patriarch's office, the head butler, John Barrymore, delivered some unsettling news to the Baskerville clan patriarch, Hugo le Baskerville. The Morgue clan had been causing trouble in the ruby mines, claiming it as their territory. However, Patriarch Hugo assured John that they would handle the matter when the Morgue clan reached out to them. John then reported on the interim evaluation of the juvenile fortress and informed the Patriarch that Master Vikir had scored the highest on the written exam. The practical exam was scheduled in 5 days, and the Guardian Knights had vacated the premises in preparation. However, John hesitated before informing the Patriarch of a recent incident at the juvenile fortress. John informed the Patriarch that there had been a big fight amongst the young masters at the fortress. Patriarch Hugo was concerned and asked how many of them had died. Butler John informed Hugo that there were no casualties, but Master Hybero's teeth had been completely damaged, Master Mid-Libero's jaw had been smashed in, and Master Lobero's left index finger had been amputated. While they had recovered their health since being treated, the psychological damage done to them seemed significant. Patriarch Hugo was taken aback and remarked that they wouldn't have fought amongst themselves since they were so close. John then revealed that there was some friction with another young master, an 8-year-old named Master Vikir, who had wounded the 3 young masters, and who also had the highest scores on the written exam. After Patriarch Hugo expressed his concern about the incident at the juvenile fortress, he summoned Vikir to his office. Vikir arrived with a smile on his face, and Patriarch Hugo commented on how much he had grown since they last met. Patriarch Hugo then brought up the issue of Vikir disabling the 9-year-old triplets in his senior class. Vikir responded that the brothers had received proper medical treatment since then. However, Patriarch Hugo pointed out that he was not talking about physical disabilities, but the disability of the heart. He explained how the incident had torn the brothers' relationship apart and asked Vikir if he thought what he did was wrong. To this, Vikir responded with a question of his own, asking what did he do wrong. Patriarch Hugo pointed out that he had turned his brothers into a total mess. Vikir, with a confident look in his crimson eyes, replied that he was stronger, and how could the stronger person be wrong? Patriarch Hugo then revealed Vikir's brothers had forgiven him, yet he still didn't feel an ounce of guilt. Vikir seemed surprised by this news and asked, "They forgave me?" Vikir suddenly recalled a memory before his regression. The youngest daughter of a family that was ruined by the Baskerville clan came to pay Hugo a visit. She had become a nun after many years, and she forgave Hugo despite his clan being responsible for the ruin of her family. Vikir repeated the same line that Hugo had said to the nun, that forgiveness is an excuse made by the weak who cannot seek revenge due to their lack of strength. As Vikir talked about the importance of strength, Hugo showed his approval by nodding and his eyes glowing with agreement. He then turned to the head butler, Barrymore, and instructed him to allow Vikir to take any snack he wanted from the food storage, enough for him to carry on his own. Vikir expressed his gratitude by requesting chocolates. As Vikir was leaving with head butler, Hugo addressed him as his son, urging him to perform well on the upcoming evaluation and not to lose to the direct descendants. Vikir acknowledged the advice, but his face was filled with hatred. Vikir and head butler made their way to the storage room. The head butler began to inform him about the chocolate. He explained that it was the highest quality chocolate that the Morgue clan had obtained with much difficulty, and that it was enjoyed by their gourmands. However, Vikir quickly interrupted him and stated that he didn't want anything that was processed. The head butler was taken aback by this and asked for clarification. Vikir then requested cacao beans, ones that had a rich aroma. The head butler was confused but complied and had the beans brought to Vikir. As Vikir put one of the beans in his mouth, the chef informed him that they were the bloody beans known for their rich aroma, and that with just one bean, he could produce 100 liters of chocolate. The head butler watched as Vikir ate the bitter bean and thought to himself that Vikir must really love chocolate to eat something so bitter on its own. And this was a good method to obtain more chocolate, as after being processed, he would have a huge amount of chocolate available. The chef asked Vikir if he wanted them to process the beans and send them to his room, but Vikir declined and said he would take them as is. The head butler was left wondering if Vikir just had peculiar tastes. Vikir had no interest in eating the chocolate, but he had a plan for the cacao beans. Vikir planned to use the beans in the upcoming practical exam in 5 days. Little did they know, a catastrophic event would soon occur, unlike anything that had ever happened before in the Baskerville clan's history. In this world, the Baskerville family is known as the Berserker family due to the intense training and evaluation that their children undergo from a young age. The training begins when the children are able to take their first steps, and they are immediately put through a rigorous test of their stamina. They must run up a steep mountain and are not allowed to lie down or rest on their stomachs except for allocated times. As if this wasn't enough, when it's time for them to sleep, they are required to sleep alongside a monster corpse. This is to help them adjust to tough environments and become resilient in the face of danger. These extreme practices are what make the Baskerville family feared and respected throughout the land. After this period of grueling training, the children reach the age of 8 and the real test begins. The young hounds, as they are called, must undergo a deadly evaluation. This is the defining moment that has earned the Baskerville family its notorious reputation. Now, on the outskirts of the territory, there is a mountain known as the Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain. It is filled with monsters, and it is here that the young hounds gather to undergo their evaluation. The instructor of the Baskerville family, Shadow Dog Pavlov Van Baskerville, stood before the young masters and explained the rules of the test. They needed to survive for a month in the area and hunt large and strong monsters. He went on to explain that the points for being successful in surviving were 10 points, and if the young masters survived without becoming disabled, it was 30 points. If they failed other young masters and survived, it was 50 points. If they defeated a monster and survived, it was 70 points. And if they fulfilled all the above conditions, they would receive 90 points. Pavlov also told the young masters that if they stole the badge that was given to them from someone else, additional points would be given. However, if they died, they would receive 0 points. He emphasized that there were no 100 points and reminded them of Sir Hugo's lesson that a swordsman dies the moment they become arrogant. The instructor also cautioned against leaving the designated area, as Le Rouge et le Noir Mountain was a restricted area with many undiscovered things. He recommended that the young masters move within the given space where the monsters had already been subjugated. He informed them that during the exam, shadow dogs, guardian knights, would be hiding and grading them. As the young masters waited for the start of the practical exam, some of them noticed Vikir and began discussing his past feats. Despite their comments, Vikir remained composed and thought about the Le Rouge et le Noir Mountain, which he had visited before. Meanwhile, the triplets standing near Vikir were visibly nervous, sweating with fear. Shadow Dog Pavlov addressed the young masters, wishing them good luck before the bell rang, signaling the start of the exam. As soon as the bell rang, all the young masters started running towards different parts of the mountain to occupy advantageous areas. One of the young masters had a plan and thought about going to a place he had seen in the last year's exam, hoping to gain an edge. The young master behind him thought he could not survive alone, and decided to follow him, with the intention of taking it from him. Meanwhile, the triplets were arguing amongst themselves, each wanting to do things their own way and come out on top. Shadow Dog Pavlov observed as the exam began, knowing that it was important to keep casualties to a minimum. Although killing was not prohibited, it was discouraged, and any contestant who did kill would have points deducted. Pavlov and the other shadow dogs were determined to do their best to prevent any unnecessary deaths. One of the shadow dogs that was assigned to follow Vikir was surprised to see him heading towards a restricted area. He wondered where Vikir was going and if he was the rumored genius who had distinguished himself since childhood. The shadow dog was intrigued and looked forward to seeing the skills Vikir would display. Vikir approached a large tree and wondered if this was the right spot. He thought that the soft ground would be suitable for him to set up camp for a while. Vikir then considered taking a break, which left the shadow dog following him confused. While other participants were busy fighting each other for points or facing monsters, Vikir gathered wood and practiced with a wooden stick. Later on, he slept peacefully under the tree. The shadow dog who had been watching Vikir grew impatient and started to question his actions. He wondered how long it had been since Vikir had taken a break and observed that he spent most of his time digging holes, hunting for food, or collecting equipment. The shadow dog started to doubt the rumors about Vikir's supposed genius, wondering if he was planning on hiding instead of actively participating in the exam. At last, the shadow dog decided to leave and find something interesting elsewhere. As soon as the shadow dog left, Vikir's face lit up with a smile. He was happy that he could finally relax and thought to himself that camping outside reminded him of the old days. Vikir recalled a conversation with his groupmate about using cacao beans to make fish smell less fishy. He threw some bloody beans into the fire and remarked that the interfering shadow dog was finally gone, and he had finished all his preparations. He wondered if he should start his hunt now. A few days later, Vikir entered the restricted area and recognized it from his scouting days. As he was roaming around, he noticed a burning smell and burnt tree roots. He knew that the habitat of the monster he was looking for was around there. Suddenly, he spotted burning stool and realized that he had found it. There was only one monster around there that produced that kind of dropping, a hellhound. The hellhound stood in front of Vikir with flame erupting from its mouth. The hellhound was a dog from hell that brought horrific disasters to those who encountered it. It had a risk rating of B+ and was 3 meters in size. Its sulfuric flames that came out of its mouth and eyes were extremely gaseous and could trigger sparks. If it bit someone, they could not survive. The living things used as firewood would burn and not go out until they completely disappeared. Vikir knew that he was in trouble when he saw the towering figure of the lookout monster that swallowed the hellfires of the oil world, the hellhound. The beast was known to be one of the most dangerous monsters in the land, and Vikir had barely survived his encounter with one when he was just 18 years old in his past life. Now, as an 8-year-old, Vikir knew that it would be impossible for him to defeat the hellhound alone. But he remembered a way to take on the beast that even a child could manage. As the hellhound lunged towards him, Vikir quickly dodged to the side, remembering the first weakness of hellhounds. They could only move in straight lines. They found it difficult to suddenly change directions. Vikir quickly dropped some water on the ground, and as the hellhound charged towards him, he shouted out the second weakness of lookout monsters. They were unable to cross water. Because of the water Vikir dropped, the hellhound took a longer route to reach Vikir, giving him more time to dodge. Vikir knew that even a shallow depth of water could slow them down significantly, exposing the weakness common to all canine monsters, opening their mouth while running. Vikir found himself in another life-threatening situation as the bloodthirsty hellhound attacked him. But Vikir was prepared, and he threw a bloody bean into the monster's mouth, causing it to whimper in pain and become unable to move. Vikir explained that chocolate was poison to canines, and with the bloody bean's power to make 100 liters of chocolate with just one bean, it was obvious what it would do to a canine monster like the hellhound. He drew his sword and aimed for the hellhound's weak spot, where the ribs were not present, the kidney. With a swift and decisive strike, Vikir pierced the hellhound's kidney, killing it easily. As he absorbed the energy called XP or karma from the defeated monster, Vikir felt his body getting stronger. He swung his sword and felt it becoming lighter, knowing that he was catching up to where he was before his regression, before he even reached the age of 15. Vikir couldn't help but wonder what kind of expression Hugo would make when he brought back a monster with a risk rating of B+ as an 8-year-old child. Vikir stood there, ready to take the head of the hellhound he had just defeated, feeling confident in his abilities. He knew he had already secured first place in the practical test, and was eager to claim his reward, something he never would have dreamed of in his past life. But his moment of triumph was short-lived as a group of hellhounds approached him, likely seeking revenge for their fallen comrade. Vikir remained calm and collected, already knowing the weaknesses of these creatures and how to defeat them. As the hellhounds drew nearer, Vikir took out his sword and prepared to take them on. He had plenty of bloody beans left and was ready to use them to his advantage. With a smirk on his face, he cut the dead hellhound's head and taunted the hellhounds, knowing they were no match for his skills and knowledge. He had already defeated one of their kind and was prepared to take them all down. The hellhounds suddenly started whimpering, which immediately caught Vikir's attention. He couldn't believe that the fierce beasts were feeling scared of a mere 8-year-old's bloodthirst. Hellhounds would never submit to their prey, even if they were to die. Vikir thought to himself, trying to figure out what could have caused the hellhounds to feel so uneasy. As Vikir turned around, he saw a monstrous creature with 3 heads standing before him. It was a Cerberus, the legendary 3-headed dog from Greek mythology. The creature was massive, measuring at least 7 meters in size, and Vikir knew that a Cerberus had a risk rating of A+. Vikir was bewildered as to what a Cerberus, which typically inhabited the 7th ridge of the Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain, was doing here. The Cerberus was known as the ultimate lookout monster, residing in a place where all the dead spirits were headed. Vikir noticed that the Cerberus was bleeding and had multiple arrows stuck in its body. He realized that someone might have been hunting it, and it had come all the way to this place being chased. This was his chance to kill an injured A+ rank monster, and he decided to attack the Cerberus. Despite the Cerberus being a powerful and dangerous creature, Vikir had been hiding his true abilities as a sword expert and had already reached a high level of expertise. His body had been strengthened by the river Styx, and all the weapons he possessed were working well against the injured Cerberus. With his refined swordsmanship, which he had developed through wars with the demon clans, he successfully landed some hits on the Cerberus. Vikir thought that he could do it, as an injured Cerberus was doable. Vikir's attack on the Cerberus seemed to be working, and he thought he had a chance of defeating the injured A+ rank monster. However, in a moment of carelessness, Vikir let his guard down, allowing the Cerberus to strike back with its claws. The first attack broke Vikir's sword, and the second sent him flying through the air. The force of the Cerberus's attack sent Vikir hurtling towards a tree trunk. With a sickening thud, he smashed into the tree trunk, and blood poured from his mouth. The impact had clearly caused a serious injury, and Vikir lay still, his body broken and unmoving. Vikir's eyes opened slowly, and a surge of panic rushed through him as he remembered the direct attack of the Cerberus and felt a sharp pain in his left arm. He wondered if the beast had ripped his arm off in the attack, but when he looked down, he saw that it was still attached to his body, with some injuries. Vikir was relieved that the Cerberus was wounded and had not managed to sever his arm completely. He thought about the river Styx, and how its magical properties might have played a role in protecting him from the beast's full force. He felt grateful for its protection, but knew he couldn't rely on it completely. His relief was short-lived, however, as he quickly realized that the damage was still significant. He knew he wouldn't be able to take another hit from the Cerberus, and so he dodged as the beast attacked him once again. As an experienced hunter, He knew that he had to find the best way out of situations like this. The best possible decision right now was to run, with his tail tucked between his legs. As he ran, Vikir's mind raced with thoughts of survival. He knew that he had to find a way out of this situation, and fast. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. That's when he saw it. An iron fence just a few yards away. Vikir's heart leaped with hope. He knew that if he could get past that fence, he would be out of the restricted area and closer to safety. He pushed himself harder, running with all his might. With a burst of adrenaline, Vikir pushed himself through the gate, his heart pounding with relief. He had made it out of the restricted area, but he knew that he was not out of danger yet. He had to reach that place, the safe haven he had prepared for himself before embarking on this dangerous mission. As he ran, he searched for something in the woods nearby, his heart racing with the fear of being caught by the hellhound. Finally, he spotted what he was looking for, a pit he had prepared beforehand. He jumped forward, narrowly avoiding Cerberus's jaws, and the hellhound fell into the pit full of wooden spears. Vikir couldn't help but smile to himself, knowing that he had prepared well for this battle. He had smeared the wooden spears with the bloody bean essence that acted as poison for the canid monsters. Cerberus growled and foam started oozing from its mouth, but Vikir remained focused and prepared for the next phase of the battle. He knew that Cerberus was a high-ranking demon, and that this fight would be one of the toughest of his life. Vikir prepared a wooden spear, and he threw it at Cerberus, hitting the hellhound's side. But the Cerberus was still alive, and walking towards him, ready to attack. Vikir counted the hellhound's steps as it approached him, one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. As soon as Cerberus took the 7th step, it stopped abruptly, falling to the ground right in front of Vikir. Vikir let out a sigh of relief, realizing that the rumors were true. The wooden spear he had just thrown was not like the others. It was a spear laced with the venomous fang of the deadly bloody mamba snake that prevented its victim from walking more than 7 steps once they were bitten. Vikir had hidden it away when he was younger, knowing that it could come in handy one day. The energy emanating from Cerberus' body entered Vikir as he stood over the 3 lifeless heads of the beast. He marveled at the power he now possessed, but his mind quickly turned to the concern of how he was going to transport the massive body back. He knew that the cause of the Cerberus's death would be obvious to anyone who saw it, and he began to consider who might be his witness. Perhaps the guardian knight who had seen him carving the wooden spears could be of help. But then, Vikir's thoughts turned to something else entirely. The Cerberus was a gatekeeper, which meant that it was guarding something. A dungeon, most likely, that could be nearby. Vikir's heart quickened at the thought of the treasure that might be hidden within. He knew that dungeons were often the lairs of powerful monsters. Vikir was determined to explore the dungeon, but before going there, he took a handful of Cerberus feces and applied it to his body. Vikir knew that by doing this, he could avoid any small monsters that might be lurking in his path. Vikir's keen senses were on full display as he tracked the steps of the Cerberus through the forest. He noted the dried soil, the rotten leaves, and the moist roots, following the trail with a single-minded focus. As he backtracked the path, his eyes widened in recognition. This was the dungeon that the Cerberus had been guarding, and Vikir realized that he had been here before. He knew that this dungeon would be discovered in another 10 years, but he was certain that it would be completely empty by then. Right now, however, he could feel the mana beneath the rotten surface. Vikir cautiously approached the dungeon. He looked around, but he didn't see any light, and he realized that the dungeon must be deeper than he initially thought. But Vikir was undaunted. His crimson eyes glowed with excitement as he stepped inside the dungeon. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of treasures were waiting for him inside. As Vikir made his way through the dark dungeon, he saw ruby minerals that were scattered throughout the area. He was certain that these veins must be connected to the nearby Red All Mountain. Suddenly, he saw a glimmer of light shining from within the dungeon, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was the entrance he had been searching for. Eager to explore further, he quickened his pace and soon found himself standing in a brightly lit room. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he was struck by the sight of a massive ruby placed on a pillar in the center of the room. He couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the gem, and he realized that it must be infused with mana to produce such a bright glow. However, his moment of awe was interrupted when he spotted a nearby skeleton lying on the ground. As he approached, He noticed signs of violence, including deep stab wounds and dried brown bloodstains. He realized that someone had been here before him, and it had been quite some time since their untimely demise. Curious, Vikir picked up a letter that was lying next to the skeletal remains. The writer of letter began by introducing himself as Cain and explaining that he didn't want to dirty the pure white paper with his name. As Vikir read on, he realized that the handwriting was that of a Baskerville, and he wondered if the writer was a member of that Baskerville family. The letter went on to describe how Cain and his brother Abel had stumbled upon the legendary stone chamber that had been talked about within the family for generations. The two brothers had managed to navigate countless trials and kill many monsters in their quest to reach the chamber. However, the final assignment they found within had tied them there for 3 long years. Vikir couldn't believe the sacrifice they made for the treasure within the dungeon. He wondered what kind of treasure could possibly be worth such a sacrifice. His attention was drawn back to the present as he gazed upon the magnificent ruby at the center of the chamber, realizing that it must be the key to unlocking the final assignment of the dungeon. Vikir read the puzzle on the monument out loud. When entering, it's 1, but once inside, it's 2. When leaving, it's 1. He couldn't make sense of it, but he remembered reading in the letter that Cain and Abel had also struggled with it. According to the letter, the two brothers had contemplated over the ominous text for a long time before coming to a conclusion. Cain had written that he and Abel were twins who were separated at birth. In order to obtain the treasure of the dungeon, they needed to become one again. That meant only one of them could leave with the treasure. Cain had ended up killing his own brother in a fierce battle, but despite that, there was no change. They had definitely gone from 2 to 1, but Cain couldn't take the treasure. After moments of regret, Cain had decided to leave the place and warn others not to come. He had written in the letter that there was nothing to obtain from this devil's den that only serves to taunt humans. Vikir read the letter carefully as Cain recounted their journey to the dungeon. They had faced countless challenges to get there, but now they were left with nothing. Vikir couldn't help but think about the assignment he had been given, and the fact that it was the same as Cain and Abel's, despite the fact that he didn't have a twin. He knew that Cain and Abel had misinterpreted the text, but what did it mean? When entering, it's 1, but once inside, it's 2. When leaving, it's 1. The words echoed in his mind as he tried to decipher their meaning. Vikir refused to give up. He knew that there was no dungeon that could not be beaten, and he was determined to solve this puzzle. Vikir examined the skeleton carefully and suddenly had a realization. He thought about Cain and Abel's failure and understood that their downfall was their fixed mindset as two individuals. As he walked towards the ruby in the middle of room, he analyzed the dark passageway leading to a bright stone chamber and realized that the answer to the dungeon was in the riddle. I am 1 when entering through the dark passageway, but as soon as the ruby's light casts a shadow on me, I become 2. And when darkness re-enters, is when the stone chamber's final stage will open. As he broke the ruby, Vikir revealed that the answer was shadow. As Vikir broke the ruby, a sudden flash of light illuminated the room, revealing the treasure that had been hidden in the dungeon. Vikir's eyes widened in amazement as he realized what lay before him was the cause of the two brothers' deaths. Standing in front of him was a sword that emitted an evil aura, placed upon a stone. Vikir was shocked at the sight of the sword and wondered if it was the relic of the devil's den. As he examined the sword, his eyes fell upon the text inscribed on the stone beneath it. It stated that only those with Baskerville's blood would be able to take Beelzebub. He was surprised and shocked to learn that the sword Beelzebub originated from this very place. At the mention of sword Beelzebub, his mind raced with memories of a childhood long gone. He recalled a picture book he had seen as a child, which depicted the gluttonous fly Beelzebub, an unprecedented great monster that had invaded the continent in old legends. He remembered that Beelzebub was part of the devil's holy constellation, also known as the 7 calamities, and that the heads of the 7 families had stepped up to stop them. Vikir recalled that the first Baskerville patriarch had fought Beelzebub, and the remnants of its power had been stored in the lands of Baskerville. The demonic energy of Beelzebub was said to have lured monsters, and although the legend was dismissed by most as a mere myth, Vikir knew that it was true. The sword in front of him was proof of that. Vikir also recalled that the blade in front of him had been taken by the demon clans, resulting in countless deaths among humans on the battlefield. As Vikir tried to pull the sword out, he declared that it would never fall into the demon clan's hands again because it was his now. Suddenly, he felt an energy entering his hand, and he exclaimed in surprise. He held the hilt firmly in his hand, and suddenly, the sword disappeared from sight. A moment later, it reappeared, fully fused with Vikir's hand. As Vikir extended his hand, the sword Beelzebub emerged from it, emitting a faint aura. Vikir gazed at the blade with wonder, knowing it was made from the corpse of a devil's holy constellation. He felt lucky to have received such a powerful weapon. With a grin on his face, Vikir wondered how much stronger he would become in this life with Beelzebub at his side, and the anticipation filled him with excitement. After exploring the dungeon and realizing that there was nothing else for him to obtain, Vikir made the decision to head back. However, as he was leaving, he suddenly felt something strange happening to his body. He fell on his knees, feeling dizzy and hungry. As Vikir looked down at his hand, he heard Beelzebub's voice echoing, and Vikir realized that it was not he who was hungry, but the sword itself. As Vikir walked out of the dungeon, he clutched his stomach with a painful expression. The hunger that had gripped Beelzebub had taken a toll on him, and he wondered if his sense of smell had been heightened as a result. Suddenly, Beelzebub began to pull Vikir towards a certain direction, tugging at his hand as if urging him to follow. Vikir ran in the direction that the sword was leading him, curious about what he would find. As he reached the location, he saw that it was the corpse of the hellhound that he had killed earlier. Vikir was surprised to see that Beelzebub was drawn to the corpse, and he extended the sword towards it. Vikir watched as Beelzebub absorbed the blood of the hellhound, feeling his own hunger subside as the sword's voracious appetite was sated. He couldn't help but wonder if Beelzebub's hunger had caused the trees and soil in the nearby mountain to dry up. As he looked down at Beelzebub, Vikir felt a sense of responsibility towards the sword and thought to himself, feeling a sense of frustration at Beelzebub's unpredictable nature. Beelzebub finished its meal, making a satisfied sound. Vikir watched as the sword's hunger was finally sated, and he took the opportunity to study its abilities. He looked at the slots on the sword and saw that Beelzebub's inherent ability was called Glutton of Flies. Vikir knew that this power allowed the sword to absorb the skills of its opponents, making it a formidable weapon in battle. However, the absorption amount was nearly infinite, which meant that countless people had lost their abilities and become obsolete after facing Beelzebub. Vikir was aware of the hazardous nature of this power, and he knew that he could only steal up to 3 abilities for the sword. As he examined the first slot on Beelzebub, Vikir saw that it was now equipped with the Hemorrhage Hellhound skill, which was rated B+. This skill allowed the sword to constantly pump out the blood of its opponent, even through the smallest of wounds. Vikir suddenly got an idea and went to the dead Cerberus's body, with Beelzebub starting its work. However, Vikir tried to stop it, saying that it couldn't devour all of it, as he wouldn't be able to explain it during the autopsy if it was too damaged. Vikir lightly tapped Beelzebub on his hand and said, "Enough." Beelzebub cried out in pain like a little child. Afterward, Beelzebub now had all 3 slots full: Burn Injury Cerberus A+ rank, Hemorrhage Hellhound B+ rank, and High-Speed Regeneration Norvegicus Sewer Rat F rank. Vikir was surprised to see the High-Speed Regeneration ability and noticed a dead rat under the Cerberus. He realized that Beelzebub had consumed the sewer rat that was crushed underneath the Cerberus. Vikir thought it was a great achievement to have acquired the Burn Injury skill from the Cerberus, as thermalgia is one of the worst pains a human could experience. It would be much worse than the Hellhound's hemorrhage. Now that they were done preparing the monster to submit for the practical exam, Vikir suggested waiting there until it was over. The young hounds had completed their practical examinations and returned to Baskerville, where they eagerly awaited their evaluations. As the evaluations were done, the young hounds received a shield, sword, or necklace as their reward produced from the parts of the monsters the hounds had hunted during their exams. But one young hound who had hunted one particular monster had left a lasting impression on the Baskervilles who were present. Hugo, the patriarch of the Baskerville family, sat in his office, looking surprised as he asked his head butler a question: "Who caught what?" The head butler responded, informing him that Master Vikir van Baskerville, an 8-year-old hound, had hunted the Cerberus, an A+ ranking monster, who had accidentally crossed over to the restricted area during the practical exam. Hugo was surprised that Vikir hunted a high-ranking monster that even the family's guardian knights tended to avoid. The head butler went on to explain that the monster had been wounded by the barbarian tribe, and that Master Vikir had applied poison to his wooden spear to hunt the Cerberus, but there was no further information on what kind of poison it was or how he obtained it. Hugo was intrigued, but the head butler could only report what was written in the hunting journal. He had planned to ask Master Vikir about it, but the young hound had returned to his dorm, stating that he was quite tired. Hugo was amused, remarking that the little brat was already so sly. He believed that information was power, and power was worth something. The head butler couldn't help but express his shock, saying that he was surprised that a hound named Van rather than Le or La was so talented. Hugo responded, saying that he did not discriminate based on a hound's bloodline. He raised hounds based on their talent and spite, not their lineage. This meant that even mutts could come from royal bloodlines. The head butler was left wondering if Hugo was concerned about his second son, who was preparing for isolation training. However, he didn't voice his thoughts aloud, and simply apologized. Hugo dismissed his apology, but said that he needed a mood booster, and head butler responded by saying that he will summon Master Vikir. Vikir stood in front of Patriarch Hugo, looking composed and confident. Hugo asked him about his success in catching the Cerberus during his practical exam, and Vikir calmly replied that he had used chocolate on his wooden spear, as it was a lethal poison for canid monsters. This surprised Hugo, who then realized the reason why Vikir had asked for chocolate before the hunt. The head butler, who was present in the room, was taken aback by the lack of a proper greeting between the two, wondering if this was really a conversation between a father and son. But the conversation continued, with Hugo asking Vikir why he had not responded properly when the butler had questioned him about the hunt. Vikir explained that the butler was not his master, and when Hugo asked who his master was, Vikir simply said that as he belonged to the clan, the master of the clan was his master as well. Hugo smirked as he congratulated Vikir on his successful hunt, telling him that as a reward, the monster's corpse would be his alone to claim. And as the highest scorer, he had the privilege of making a wish. Vikir's eyes lit up at the opportunity, and he knew exactly what he wanted. With a determined expression, he spoke his wish aloud, requesting access to the 10,000 Epistle Library. 10,000 Epistle Library was one of the largest libraries in the Empire, located deep within the heart of the Baskerville clan. Hugo raised an eyebrow in surprise at the request, reminding Vikir that only the patriarch and second in command, along with their direct descendants, were permitted to enter the library. Undeterred, Vikir stated that he was willing to give up if it wasn't allowed, but secretly he was already planning to sneak in. To his surprise, however, Hugo granted him permission to enter the library. Vikir was shocked, but it didn't end there. Hugo instructed him to read the Baskerville 6th Technique, which was located within the 6th restricted zone deep inside the library. Vikir was taken aback as he heard that Hugo was allowing a child with the Van middle name to read the Baskerville 6th Technique. It was unheard of for an illegitimate child to be allowed to go beyond the 4th technique. However, Vikir tried to stay calm and rationalize the situation. After all, it was only the 6th technique. But despite this, Vikir remained determined. He knew that Hugo was currently at the Baskerville 7th technique, and before his regression, Hugo was able to bear 9 fangs. But he hadn't forgotten about the discrimination he had faced as an illegitimate child, and he was determined to rise above Hugo's level. His goal was to obtain the greatest essence of Baskerville, the textbook of swordsmanship containing the teachings of the first patriarch who was able to subjugate the 7 great disasters. He knew that this book would be the key to his success, and Hugo will be the one to hand it over to him. As Hugo smiled faintly and wished Vikir good luck, Vikir bowed and thanked him. He knew that Hugo had no idea of the true value of the random book he was handing over, but that didn't matter to Vikir. Vikir arrived at the 10,000 Epistle Library for the first time and gazed around in amazement. As he browsed through the books, he read out their names to himself: Severing Incisors, Grinding Molars, Piercing Canines, Snaggletooth that Embeds Twice, Wisdom Teeth that Lay Down, and other books on swordsmanship. These were the books on swordsmanship that he had desperately wanted to learn in his past life. However, Vikir knew that no matter how much mana an illegitimate child of Baskerville had, they could not learn any swordsmanship that was superior to the 4th technique. The Baskerville family had implemented this as a defense mechanism to ensure that the children who became hounds did not bare their teeth towards their master. Vikir eventually arrived at a place where a book was locked with chains with a lock in the middle. He wondered if this was it, the book on the 6th technique. He couldn't believe that Hugo had offered him the book on the 6th technique. Vikir knew that if it was before he regressed, he never would have dreamt of this opportunity. As Vikir unlocked the lock, he thought to himself that of course Hugo had allowed this, thinking that an 8-year-old child wouldn't be able to memorize the contents of the book in a day. But before Vikir's regression, he had already learnt the theory behind the 1st to 4th technique until he got sick of it. He had done this in order to deduce and speculate the theory of the 5th technique. Vikir had a realization that after drawing the 4th tooth, he needed to have stopped the flow of mana. Perhaps that was why he couldn't make the 5th tooth. The Baskerville swordsmanship had a unique trait where, depending on the stage of the sword, it's 1 tooth for the 1st technique, 2 teeth for the 2nd, and so on. And when you draw teeth, a special trait, a red sword energy, appears. Despite getting a chance to read the book on the 6th technique, Vikir didn't care about it. He had come to the 10,000 epistle library for a different reason, to find a stage that was higher than the one he was currently at. Vikir walked out of the swordsmanship book section of the library, catching the guards by surprise. They questioned him in disbelief. That was he done reading books already? The guards offered to get him more books, mentioning that there were other swordsmanship books deep within the library. But Vikir declined and assured them that he had finished what he came for. The guards were amazed that Vikir was done so quickly and suggested that he stay longer to browse other books. Vikir assured them and said that he was thinking of reading other books before leaving. As Vikir walked away, the guards began whispering amongst themselves, commenting that the section Vikir was going to was filled with miscellaneous books. One of the guards suggested that if it were him, he would read about the textbooks on swordsmanship that were deep within the library. He wondered if Vikir didn't know their worth because he was young. Vikir overheard their conversation and thought to himself that he would leave them to their thoughts. He knew that among the dusty miscellaneous books lay a hidden treasure. As Vikir looked around the library, suddenly his eyes lit up as he spotted a book titled A Lurking Ambush. He reached for it and held it in his hands, knowing that it was the book he had been searching for. He examined it and noted that it was a useless miscellaneous book with ripped pages, but he knew its true worth. He remembered a time before his regression when he was affiliated with the Hound squad. They had found a single ripped page from a swordsmanship textbook, with Baskerville's handwriting on it. Hugo, who was obsessed with finding the book that matched the page, had scoured the entire library and finally found it in A Lurking Ambush. The book contained the Baskerville ancestors' writings, including the 10th technique that Hugo had gone crazy over. He had sent hounds to the 7 great families to obtain the remaining 6 pages, even declaring war on those who refused. After the sacrifice of many hounds, all the missing pages were given to Hugo. But in the end, the only reward he received was a simple word, "Good job." Because of this, Hugo had broken through the 7th technique and achieved the 9th technique, but it came at a terrible cost. Under him was a pile of wasted hound corpses and blood. Vikir's eyes narrowed with anger as he recalled this memory and said that it was a stupid life. He knew he could not let it happen again. Vikir remembered all the contents of those missing pages and realized that the only reason he couldn't progress beyond the 4th technique was that he had no access to the original book. He knew that those missing pages held the key to mastering the techniques. Without them, the book was nothing but a collection of random and useless techniques. After reading the book for a while, he said aloud that if other people read this book, it would seem like a miscellaneous book that didn't make any sense. But the moment you use the missing pages and fill in the blanks, the false and misleading information turns into an amazing masterpiece of a book. Vikir had reached the highest level of graduator aura and the highest level of the 4th technique before he regressed. He knew he could do it again, but this time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. He made a vow to himself that before he turned 15, he would reclaim the power he had lost. Vikir was deeply engrossed in reading the book, and time seemed to pass quickly. When he finally closed the book, he realized that the night had turned into day. He was amazed at how much he had achieved during this time, and felt proud of himself for memorizing the entire book's contents. As Vikir stood up, he took notice of his surroundings and realized that the guardian knights were nowhere to be seen. He knew that he could not draw 10 teeth with a young body, but he was confident that currently he had the potential to achieve the fifth technique that he couldn't reach in his previous life. Vikir entered a focused and determined state with the statue before him. He began to strike it with his Baskerville sword technique, unleashing his full power with each attack. First, he executed the first technique, then the second technique, followed by the third technique, and finally, the fourth technique. As he fought, memories of his past flooded his mind. He remembered how hard he had worked to obtain the highest level of graduator aura in his previous life, but he couldn't learn a suitable sword technique, and only met with hostility from the people of the direct bloodline because he was an illegitimate child, and that was also the reason why he could not go beyond the fifth technique. But this time, Vikir was determined not to let his past hold him back. He attacked the statue with all his might, channeling his anger and frustration into his sword strikes. In the midst of his attacks, Vikir's thoughts turned defiant. With a vivid image of Hugo's face on the statue in front of him, he unleashed his technique, cutting through the statue with precision. Vikir breathed heavily and wondered if he was able to execute the fifth technique. He clenched his hands and smiled as he felt a hot sensation rise from his heart to his neck. He was overwhelmed with happiness, to the point that he could cry. Suddenly, he realized that he needed a sword to test his newly learned technique. At that moment, at a record-breaking speed in Baskerville's history, a young hound's canine teeth started to grow that were bared towards its master. Vikir beamed with pride, his body still trembling with excitement from his success in drawing the fifth tooth. He couldn't believe how far he had come, and how quickly he had managed to do it. He marveled at the strength of his mana, now able to support him at a level he had only achieved after years of hard work in his previous life. As he looked at the liquid aura flowing within him, a sign of his newfound status as a graduator, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Graduators were on a completely different level from sword experts, and he was now one of them. It was a point that had taken him 30 years to reach in his previous life, and yet here he was, only 8 years old. The solid aura within him had transformed into a liquid state, with increased density that allowed him to use it more freely. Vikir felt confident about his new skills and abilities, and he knew that he could achieve much more. He was determined to master the lurking ambush sword technique and use it to its full potential. He realized that with this technique, he could smoothly transition between offense and defense, making it the perfect technique with no limitations. Vikir carefully placed the book near the window and took a moment to reflect on his progress. He knew that he had come a long way since his regression, and he was now stronger and more skilled than ever before. He felt that he could challenge a mid-class graduator if he put his mind to it, and he was confident that he could win using his new skills. However, Vikir also knew that he couldn't reveal too much of his strength to Hugo. He needed to give Hugo something to look forward to, so he had enough time to take everything he needed. Vikir took out a magnifying lens and placed it carefully near the book. The sun's rays converged onto the pages of the book throughout the lens, and a little fire started burning it. With an evil grin, Vikir commented that the destruction of the book would make it difficult for Hugo and the hounds to reach the 10th technique, although Vikir himself would have no such difficulty. Suddenly, the guards, who had been nowhere to be seen, arrived in the library. The smell of burning paper had caught their attention. They were startled to see Vikir there and demanded to know what had happened. Vikir's expression quickly changed to one of apology, and he explained that he had accidentally left the magnifying glass around, which had caused the fire. He offered to inform the butlers of the incident. The guards knew that they could be punished heavily for this, and after a brief pause, one of them spoke up that this was not something that he needed to apologize for. It was their fault for not looking after him properly, and they were just glad that this was an area with only useless books. Vikir asked if they were busy with the Morgue clan regarding the ruby mines. He thought they wouldn't have time to deal with small problems like this, especially since they weren't even there to begin with. The guards agreed to keep it a secret, as long as Vikir was willing to do the same. As he started walking away, Vikir suggested they keep the incident between themselves, and he apologized for taking up their time. As Vikir walked away, the guards spoke to each other about how nice and considerate he was towards the workers. They believed he deserved to be respected. Little did they know, Vikir had a mischievous grin on his face as he left them behind. As Vikir stood in Hugo's office, Hugo asked him if he had learned something enlightening in the library. Vikir responded that he had learned of something warm and sharp, yet soft and viscous. This statement shocked both Hugo and the head butler, who realized that Vikir might have achieved the aura. Aura was a sign of officially entering the world of the sword. Even geniuses must train without rest until the age of 15 to reach the level of low-class sword expert. Hugo was excited but then realized that Vikir was only 8 years old and denied the thought of Vikir reaching that level. He then asked Vikir if he could show his father what he had learned, to which Vikir responded affirmatively. In the Colosseum-like structure, Vikir stood with a sword in his hand as many young hounds watched with confused looks on their faces. Head butler asked Hugo how he planned on testing Vikir's skills, to which Hugo replied that he was going to release a monster for Vikir to deal with. Head butler was shocked at the idea of releasing a monster, and Hugo confirmed that he had prepared a hungry and feisty one. The gate in front of Vikir opened and a guard brought in the chained orc. The orc was a massive green-skinned creature with bulging muscles and razor-sharp tusks protruding from its mouth. Its beady eyes darted around the Colosseum, sizing up its opponents. The young hounds in the audience looked on in shock and awe at the sight of the fearsome creature. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, questioning whether it was really necessary to send an orc to face an 8-year-old. They wondered if the Guardian Knights would have to intervene if things got out of hand. Despite the audience's doubts, Vikir remained calm and collected, ready to face the orc with his sword. Hugo gave permission, and the guard opened the orc's chains. The orc let out a loud roar and charged towards Vikir. However, Vikir remained calm and waited for the right moment to strike. As the orc approached him, Vikir swung his sword with lightning speed, cutting off the orc's arm in a swift motion. The audience, as well as the orc, were shocked by Vikir's sudden display of strength. But Vikir didn't waste any time and quickly swung his sword again, cutting off the orc's leg cleanly. The orc fell to the ground, growling in pain. Vikir, on the other hand, remained composed and analyzed the situation. He realized that the orc must be surprised that it was bleeding for the first time, and that its distinctive skill, high-speed regeneration, won't activate either. Vikir knew that C-class monsters won't be able to stop the hemorrhage caused by a B-class hellhound. The audience was in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. They couldn't believe that an 8-year-old could be that strong. Some wondered if it was even possible to do that without collecting mana. Vikir looked at Hugo, but the latter's face remained calm and collected, and no expression could be seen on his face. Vikir knew that Hugo was still trying to determine what he had learned inside the library and decided to show him what he wanted to see. Suddenly, Hugo's eyes began to glow, and the head butler exclaimed in shock questioning if that was Aura Blade. Vikir's sword began to glow with a bright red light as he charged towards the orc, who was attempting to stand up. With a swift strike, the Aura Blade sliced through the air and blasted off the orc's head. Hugo, who was seated on a nearby chair, couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The head butler immediately recognized the glow emanating from Vikir's sword as the aura of a low-class sword expert. He congratulated Hugo, exclaiming that they had just witnessed the birth of a genius, and that there would never be another like him in all the families of the Empire. However, Hugo's attention was drawn to the orc's blood, which continued to flow despite its reputation for rapid regeneration. He told the head butler that Vikir had only won because the orc was weak. But just then, Vikir's voice reached Hugo's ears, and he turned to face his son. With an innocent smile on his face, Vikir asked, "Is there anything stronger than this orc?" The audience, filled with young hounds, was surprised when Vikir requested a new and stronger opponent. Vikir had his own motivations for wanting to face a stronger opponent. He hoped to impress his father, Hugo, and demonstrate his progress in front of the audience. He believed that by doing so, he could be acknowledged and possibly separated from his father, like being dispatched to a remote area or admitted to an academy. Hugo, who was watching from the sidelines, commented that the orcs he had brought in from afar were not enough to satisfy his son's hunger. He agreed with Vikir and suggested that he should be facing more challenging opponents at his age. He turned to his head butler and asked him if there was a creature they had captured during a barbarian raid for experimentation. The head butler confirmed that there was just one creature left, and Hugo ordered for it to be brought in. Vikir and the audience were surprised as they watched a troll being led into the arena. Vikir stood in the arena, facing a fearsome troll that was twice his size. Vikir asked for Hugo approval to start the fight, and as Hugo gave his approval, the troll's chains were released and it lunged at Vikir with a powerful punch. But Vikir was quick and agile, and he managed to dodge the attack with ease. He swiftly moved behind the troll, taking advantage of its momentary confusion. In the audience, someone exclaimed that this was the perfect moment to attack and questioned why did Vikir missed it. Hugo, on the other hand, nodded and explained that trolls had excellent regenerative power, so only fatal attacks were worth it. And that's why a plan was needed in order to hunt a troll. As the troll charged towards Vikir, he gracefully dodged each of its attacks with ease. The audience watched in amazement as they saw Vikir evading the troll's attacks effortlessly. However, they couldn't help but wonder why Vikir wasn't fighting back. They speculated that maybe he was trying to tire the troll out, or that he was a genius who had a plan up his sleeve. After a while, Vikir realized that the fight was becoming tedious and decided to take action. He knew that if he used his full strength, he could easily kill the troll, but that would put him in a tough spot. He needed to make it seem plausible, and so he decided to use the troll's power against it. As the troll attacked again, Vikir seized the opportunity and swiftly attacked its arm, almost detaching it from the troll's shoulder. The audience gasped in amazement as they saw Vikir's quick and decisive move. They thought he had slayed the troll, but they soon realized that it would recover in an instant unless the wound was fatal. The troll's wounds began to heal at an alarming rate. Vikir realized that the only way to kill it was with Beelzebub's hemorrhage skill. However, he also knew that using such a technique would be meaningless. Hugo advised Vikir to stop before things got out of hand, but Vikir ignored the advice and replied that he was almost done. He continued and told that he was near an epiphany, and if he could not kill Troll with his next attack, he will give up. As the troll growled menacingly at Vikir, he couldn't help but ponder over how much of his true power he should reveal. He knew that he had already decided on an answer. He wanted to show a scenario where he had leveled up from an epiphany during the fight. However, he was also curious to see how Hugo would react to this. His sword glowed red as he prepared for a powerful attack. As his sword struck the troll's head, it was cleanly sliced off without any resistance. Everyone, including the head butler and the audience, was shocked by what they had just witnessed. It was unprecedented for an 8-year-old to achieve the second technique of the Baskerville clan, which was normally attained at 18 years of age. Vikir was overjoyed by his victory and had an innocent smile on his face as he declared that he had done it. However, Hugo was left in shock and couldn't believe what he had just seen. A week had passed since Vikir's impressive display of power against the troll, and he found himself sitting in the Baskerville clan's dining area, staring down at a bowl of unappetizing miscellaneous meat porridge. While eating his food, Vikir noticed that everyone was avoiding him, which didn't come as a surprise to him since power was everything in their family. But he was pleased when he saw that even Hugo was taken aback by his recent display of power. Vikir reflected on what he had revealed about himself so far, including his Baskerville second technique and mid-rank sword expertise. However, he also knew the truth that he was in fact a low-rank graduator who could weakly perform the Baskerville fifth technique. With the skill he obtained from the troll, he believed he was now stronger than the average graduator. He then remembered that he had been eating a lot more since obtaining the skill for Beelzebub's third slot, which now had a super speed regeneration troll with a C+ rating. Suddenly, the triplets appeared behind Vikir, causing him to be surprised and cautious. He thought to himself that he didn't want to deal with them again, so he turned back to his food and resumed eating. The triplets quickly explained that they just wanted to tell him that he was so cool when he defeated Cerberus and the troll. Vikir was so surprised that he spat out his porridge. The triplets asked him if he was okay, but Vikir was suspicious of their motives. He thought to himself that it might be some kind of two-faced technique or deceitful policy. He considered beating them up before thinking about it more. But before he could act, the head butler, Barrymore, appeared behind him and called out his name. Vikir was surprised to see him and wondered why he was here. Barrymore then informed him that he should hurry to the Patriarch room, and Vikir wondered why Hugo had summoned him. In Baskerville clan's Patriarch office, Patriarch Hugo sat on his chair as someone entered and greeted him. It was Morg clan Patriarch by proxy Adolf Morg. Hugo acknowledged that it had been a while, and Adolf noted that he hoped the annual event would go smoothly. Hugo assured him that the joint training had always gone without a hitch. Adolf brought up the incident from last year when 2 children were seriously injured, one from each family. Hugo tried to downplay it, saying it was but a scratch and that Morg's children seemed to be quite dramatic. Adolf retorted that it was because the Morgs were noble and dignified. The Baskervilles and the Morgs were once on good terms, as they were a renowned mage clan and iron-blooded sword clan, respectively. The past emperor had once said that magic and swords are a complementary pair, and because of this, they began joint training sessions for children between the ages of 8 and 15, which was carried out annually in a good atmosphere. However, a problem arose when a ruby mine was discovered between their territories, and blood was spilt over the conflict. As a result, the 2 patriarchs came to be on bad terms, but they had to continue with the joint training as per the emperor's command. Adolf had come in his brother's stead to ensure that the event went smoothly. Adolf mentioned to Hugo that he had heard news about a supernova appearing in the Baskerville family, which was a great blessing to the empire. He explained that a rare genius, who was perhaps only born once a century, had been born to the Baskervilles. However, Hugo responded with pride, saying that it was not that big of a deal. Adolf noticed Hugo's reaction and was surprised that Hugo actually received the compliment. But then Adolf mentioned that the Morgs also had a genius in their hands and called for his sister's daughter, Camus, to come into the room. Camus, a girl with red hair, entered the room and Adolf introduced her to Hugo as Respani's daughter. Adolf turned to Camus and asked her if she was going to greet the patriarch, but instead of answering the question, Camus accused Hugo for being the thief who stole their ruby mine and demanded that he give it back. This accusation didn't sit well with Hugo, who gave Adolf an angry stare and questioned the accusation. Camus then explained that Adolf had referred to the annoying Chinbeard as the thief who stole the ruby mine. Adolf denied ever saying such a thing, but Camus insisted that he had said it an hour and 42 minutes ago, right before getting off the carriage. Hugo, still trying to control his anger, asked for clarification, but Adolf tried to defuse the situation by suggesting that there was a misunderstanding. However, Hugo said that there was no need for Adolf to explain the Morg clan's problems with children's education to him. Camus persisted in her demand for her rubies to be returned, complaining that she couldn't even do research without them. Adolf tried to calm her down by calling out her name, but to no avail. Hugo was losing his patience and commented in anger that it seemed like the Morgs didn't teach manners at all. Adolf defended Camus, questioning what Hugo planned on doing to a child and if he was threatening an 8-year-old girl. This left Hugo speechless, as he couldn't bring himself to act in such a way that would hurt his pride. Suddenly, a new voice entered the room, remarking that the Morgs don't teach their children not to envy what belongs to others. The speaker of this voice was none other than Vikir, and the head butler informed Hugo that he had brought the young master. Adolf was taken aback by the sudden appearance of Vikir, and couldn't help but wonder if he was the Baskerville's supernova. However, his thoughts were interrupted when he realized that Camus, who was sitting right next to him, had disappeared. Camus, on the other hand, had approached Vikir and demanded to know what he had just said. Adolf called out her name, trying to stop her from causing a scene. Meanwhile, Vikir was analyzing Camus, wondering if she was the Morg clan's iron-blooded empress, Camus Morg. Vikir recalled Camus's reputation as the genius of geniuses within the Morg clan, who had raised countless great mages. At her peak, she had killed all the monsters and barbarians in the Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain by herself, burning them to death on spears and creating the famous border of blood and ashes. In addition, her beauty was captivating, and she was able to manipulate even the imperial family. As a result, she was called the fire goddess of authority. Vikir noted that this was all in the far future, and that she was just a child right now. Camus interrupted Vikir's thoughts and aggressively questioned why the ruby mine belonged to Vikir. Vikir remained calm and collected, even going as far as to call Camus out on throwing a tantrum. Camus then began to cast a spell, but instead of attacking, she created an ice sculpture to illustrate her point. Vikir was surprised by Camus' use of spell as an ice sculpture instead of an attack, as was expecting a fight to break out between the two. As Camus pointed to her creation and began to explain, Camus pointed to a nearby cave and began to explain the situation regarding the ruby mine. She stated that the mine was situated on the border between Morg and Baskerville territories and was called the Joint Security Area. Camus continued, saying that while the entrance to the mine was on Morg territory, the mine itself ran underneath Baskerville territory, preventing the Baskervilles from claiming it all for themselves. Camus emphasized that the ruby mineral vein belonged to the Morgue clan, but the Baskervilles were claiming that it was trespassing and interrupting their mining activities. Camus further explained that the Morgues had offered to pay rent for the territory, but the Baskervilles had rejected the offer. Adolf seemed pleased with this explanation, but Hugo was becoming annoyed with the situation. Vikir then mentioned that rubies were commonly used for magic ingredients and that the Baskervilles didn't need to mine them. However, he also pointed out that it was unfortunate that the Baskervilles weren't fools who would open their territories just for few pennies. Camus was surprised and confused by this statement, pointing out that if the Baskervilles didn't need rubies, then why not rent their land? Vikir explained that the Baskervilles were only interested in their land and didn't want anyone else to profit from it. He warned Camus not to come into their territory, as they were the only ones who would lose out in the situation. Camus, however, was not satisfied with this explanation and decided to take matters into her own hands. She claimed that she had possession over the ruby mineral vein, and she placed her arm over the sculpture in the Baskerville territory, asking whose arm it was. Vikir caught her arm and responded with a smile, saying that it was his arm, as it was in his land. Camus felt her face flush with embarrassment as Vikir's words made her feel flustered. She couldn't believe what she was hearing and responded with a stutter, asking him what was he talking about. How could she belong to him? Vikir, who seemed amused by Camus's reaction, replied with a mischievous grin, "Who said you're mine?" Camus was confused by Vikir's response, and suddenly, Vikir pulled out a knife from his back, which surprised not only Camus but also Adolf and the head butler. Vikir's evil grin sent chills down everyone's spine as he said, "I'm saying your arm's mine." Camus was taken aback by Vikir's sudden change in demeanor and said in a shaky voice, "What?" Hugo, who was sitting nearby, was sweating profusely, and the only sound that could be heard in the room was a hiccup. As Vikir began to move the knife towards Camus's hand, she screamed in fear and called out for help from her uncle. Adolf appeared behind Vikir with a fierce expression and demanded that he back away from his niece. Camus seized the opportunity to escape from Vikir's grip and ran towards Adolf, seeking comfort from her uncle. Adolf was enraged and demanded an explanation from Hugo, asking what was going on. Hugo looked at Vikir and acknowledged that he had gone too far with his joke. Vikir then revealed that the knife was only a toy, something that was commonly played with in the Baskerville family from a young age. Adolf was shocked and upset that such a dangerous toy was given to children, and he demanded an apology from Vikir. Vikir humbly apologized to Adolf and assured him that he had no intention of making Camus cry. However, Adolf was still angry and accused Vikir of not taking the situation seriously enough. But Hugo intervened and said that adults shouldn't meddle in affairs of children and attempted to diffuse the tension by changing the subject, suggesting that they focus on discussing the ruby mines and complete the friendly duels first. Adolf was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to hear Hugo out. Camus, still upset and tearful, warned Vikir that she would not forget what had happened. Vikir simply smiled faintly in response, seemingly unfazed by the situation. The day of the friendly duels had arrived, where all the children between the ages of 8 to 15 had gathered to show off their skills. While the younger children engaged in theoretical battles or displayed their mana sensitivity, the older children stole the show with their live battles. But this year all eyes were focused on the battle between two renowned clans, the Morgue clan and the Baskerville clan. The two geniuses of their respective clans, Camus Morgue and Vikir van Baskerville, were to showcase their skills in a practical training match. Camus instructed Vikir to get ready, emphasizing that once she was prepared, she wouldn't hold back. Without wasting any time, Camus began casting a spell, leaving the audience in awe. One spectator couldn't help but exclaim, wondering if Camus was casting quadra spells. The fact that she was able to cast 4 spells simultaneously was impressive, even more so since she was only 8 years old. Another spectator praised her, acknowledging that Camus was the genius mage of Morgue, and such feats were expected of her. Camus launched an attack on Vikir, casting 4 different spells at once. However, Vikir managed to dodge all of them with ease. With a hint of criticism in his voice, Vikir suggested to Camus that instead of trying to impress with flashy spells, she should focus on mastering one. Camus sneered at Vikir, wondering why he even cared since he was just an idiot who didn't understand magic. She retaliated by using a sand wall spell, causing a wall of sand to appear between them. But Vikir easily broke through the wall with a swift kick and commented on Camus' harsh words. Camus was surprised at Vikir's strength, wondering if this was the power of someone who had bathed in the river Styx. While she was lost in thought, Vikir launched an attack that Camus realized was impossible to dodge. She closed her eyes, thinking that she had let her guard down, but to her surprise, she didn't get hit. When she opened her eyes, Vikir was flicking his finger on her forehead. The flick sent her flying backward. Adolf, who was watching, couldn't believe that a mere flick had such power. Camus tried to ease the pain on her forehead with her hand and demanded to know why Vikir had flicked her. She accused him of going easy on her and vowed not to let him get away with it. However, Vikir just smiled and pointed to his forehead, suggesting that they should end things before they got out of hand. Camus, with almost tears in her eyes, refused to give up and casted another sand wall spell. This time she created 2 walls and proudly exclaimed that Vikir wouldn't be able to get through them. However, Vikir wasn't impressed and thought that it was pointless since he could just go around them, but he decided to play along and prepared to punch the walls. With just one punch, Vikir's hand pierced through both walls, creating a hole. Camus was surprised seeing this, and then Vikir asked a question while making a flicking gesture with his hand. He wondered whose arm had crossed the wall. As he once again flicked on Camus' forehead, he answered the question himself, saying that it was the stronger individual. The flick on Camus' forehead caused her to fall down and growl in pain. Despite this, she continued attacking Vikir, who managed to dodge her attacks. Vikir thought that dealing with children was much harder than he thought, and that he could easily crush her neck in 0.1 seconds if he put his mind to it. However, he knew that it would cause an entire issue, and wondered what he should do to calm her down. Just then, Vikir noticed that 2 other contestants were having a duel in the arena behind him. He thought it might be better to let others deal with Camus. As he turned his attention to the other contestants, he saw a swordmaster cutting a mage's spells with a sword. Vikir thought that they might be useful in executing his plan. Meanwhile, Camus was getting angrier by the minute. Her attacks were not landing on Vikir, and she couldn't understand why. She demanded that Vikir stop running away and face her. As the mage behind Vikir started casting a spell, Vikir knew it was the perfect time to strike. Vikir warned Camus to have a defensive spell ready. Camus was confused at first, but then she saw the mage's attack coming from behind Vikir. Adolf, who understood Vikir's plan, shouted in surprise, and then a powerful blast covered the whole arena. As the spell engulfed the arena, the audience reacted with gasps and shouts of surprise at what they were seeing. Lady Camus heard her Uncle Adolf's voice in the chaos and wondered what she should do. She had avoided injuries with the help of a defensive spell, but the flame spell had burned her clothes. Tears welled up in her eyes as she imagined the shame of being seen after the smoke cleared. Suddenly, Vikir appeared before her and offered his jacket to cover herself. Camus was shocked by his kindness, unable to understand why he was helping her despite being her enemy. She protested weakly, as Vikir insisted on giving her his jacket. Camus anxiously said that he would be exposed if he gave her his only jacket, but Vikir seemed unconcerned about his own well-being. Camus couldn't understand why Vikir was taking care of her, despite their enmity. Camus noticed that Vikir was bleeding from a scratch on his arm, and pointed it out to him. Vikir was surprised to see a scratch on the body strengthened by the river Styx, and realized that the sword of the idiot swordsman must have had some remaining aura on it to cause the wound. As the dust cloud began to clear, Camus and Vikir were revealed to the audience. Adolf was relieved to see that Camus was okay, and the audience observed that the Lady of Morgue was on the floor, but the one bleeding was the young Baskerville, making it difficult to determine the winner of the battle. The audience also noticed shirtless Vikir, revealing his fit physique. They marveled at his muscles, impressed by his talent for training his body at such a young age. Camus' eyes looked different as she watched Vikir, and a light blush spread across her cheeks. As Adolf hugged his niece Camus, she continued to steal glances at Vikir, unable to understand why she was feeling drawn to him despite their earlier enmity. After the battle, Hugo and Vikir walked down a dimly lit hallway. Hugo turned to Vikir and asked how the battle with the Lady of the Morgue clan was. Vikir replied that it was interesting and that he had learned the purpose of the event once again. Hugo then remarked that a battle with a mage was different from a battle between swordsmen and asked why Vikir did not go for a clear blow. Vikir hesitated before admitting that he was confused about how to deal with a lady. Hugo warned him that letting his guard down in battle would lead to injury, and that he should take the injury as a lesson. Vikir was surprised that Hugo was worried about him. He didn't remember much about what Hugo was like during his youth since he was always so cold, strict, and brutal. There were rumors that his personality had become that way because he had lost his first wife and eldest daughter, but that wasn't Vikir's problem. Hugo then changed the subject and asked Vikir what he thought they should do with the ruby mines. Vikir spoke up, suggesting that they give away control over the mines. Hugo was taken aback and asked for his reasoning. Vikir explained that the main task of the Baskerville clan was to grow their territories, and that the monsters and barbarians living in the area around the mines would become a problem during their expansion into that region. He suggested that if they could utilize the Morg clan well, they may be able to minimize the losses incurred during their expansion. Hugo agreed with Vikir's reasoning and explained his plan. Once the Morg clan receives control over the ruby mines, they will assign a great number of people there, and all they need to do is push the monsters and barbarians into that region. They would then be able to take care of all the problems at once, and the rubies would be bathed in the blood of their enemies. Hugo was confident that if that happened, the Morg clan would have to think twice before entering their territory. Hugo placed his hand on Vikir's head and acknowledged that Vikir's idea was about 90% in line with what he had in mind. Vikir, on the other hand, couldn't help but think that it was not a surprise, as the idea was originally Hugo's, as Vikir had executed the same plan in his past life on Hugo's orders. Vikir then suggested that they should keep an eye on the Morg's movements, but Hugo did not think it was necessary as he had already increased the number of hounds scouting the area. As Hugo and Vikir were walking, Adolf's voice interrupted them, calling out to Hugo. Hugo and Vikir turned their attention to Adolf as he mentioned that he had something to discuss with them before he left. They took seats in a nearby room and Hugo asked what Adolf wanted to talk about. Adolf suggested that they peacefully resolve the issues regarding the ruby mines and mentioned that fees for its usage was just one of many suggestions. He then proposed the idea of an engagement between the Morg and Baskerville children. While Hugo and Adolf discussed the details, Camus was looking at Vikir with a blush on her face. Hugo then asked Adolf which child he had in mind for the engagement. Adolf suggested a union between the eldest son of the Baskervilles and the eldest daughter of the Morgs, his niece Camus. He spoke highly of his niece, stating that she was an incredible child with both beauty and knowledge, lacking nothing. Adolf suggested that Camus would be a great fit for the child known as the small son of the Baskerville clan, but Hugo expressed concern about the significant age gap between his son and Camus, informing Adolf that his eldest son was 25 years old this year. Adolf didn't consider it a significant issue, as it was only a 17-year gap between them. Suddenly, Camus spoke and made it clear that she wouldn't marry anyone weaker than her mother, and didn't want a significant age gap in her partner. Adolf tried to persuade her by saying that she will have to live alone rest of her life if she wants to marry someone stronger than her mother. Hugo also didn't seem pleased with her attitude and reminded her that engagements weren't a buffet of her choosing, but Camus was confident in her choices and claimed she had no intention of playing around. Suddenly, her face turned red, and she looked to the side, catching the attention of Adolf and Hugo. Adolf was shocked when he realized that Camus was looking at Vikir and started cursing him in his mind. Adolf couldn't believe what he was witnessing. He whispered to Camus, urging her not to even think about it, as Vikir was from the Van surname and not from the Le Descent. Adolf believed that no matter what happens, Vikir would merely be a small fish in a big pond. Hugo, on the other hand, was getting increasingly frustrated with the situation, so he decided to intervene and reminded everyone that the most important thing in engagements was what the people involved had in mind. He then turned to Vikir and asked him for his thoughts. Camus looked at Vikir, waiting for his answer. Camus and Vikir exchanged looks, and then Vikir spoke up and said, "I accept." Adolf became visibly upset at Vikir's response, but before Adolf could say anything, Vikir continued his sentence and added that, "I accept to do as I'm told." Adolf was even more outraged at this, wondering how someone could have such an attitude towards the daughter of the Morg clan. On the other hand, Camus was blushing from head to toe, wondering what Vikir's response meant. She couldn't help but wonder if he was shyer than he portrayed himself to be, and if he wasn't opposed to the idea of their engagement. Hugo stated that names and titles had no meaning in the Baskerville household, and that great people come from those of Van descent, not just those of Le descent. However, Adolf seemed skeptical about this statement, especially when it came to Vikir. Adolf stood in front of Vikir, examining him closely. Vikir, in turn, looked back at Adolf and thought about his reputation as a six-circle master, and one of the strongest mage within the renowned clan and supporter of his niece. Adolf then spoke up, saying that he didn't think it's quite wise to tell Vikir this, but they couldn't have just anyone become Camus's husband. Vikir thought about how engagement was merely a suggestion between clans, and wondered if Adolf was not satisfied with even the genius of the Baskerville clan. Adolf then placed his hand on Vikir's shoulder and tried to press him down, but Vikir didn't budge. Adolf was surprised by Vikir's sturdy body. Adolf then asked Vikir why he wasn't answering him, and was he even listening to him? And Vikir replied that he hadn't been listening to him since he said it wasn't wise to tell him something. Camus was shocked at Vikir's reply, especially since he said it to her uncle, who was one of the strongest mage. On the side, Hugo tried to control his laughter in the midst of the tense situation. Vikir's response caused Adolf to laugh menacingly. He turned to Hugo and requested to have a deeper conversation with Vikir. Hugo questioned Adolf's intentions and asked if he was going to scold an 8-year-old child. However, Adolf responded with a laugh, stating that Vikir may become his niece's future husband, and that he was making the request as an uncle, rather than as the deputy patriarch of the Morgue clan. Camus tried to stop his uncle and pleaded with him not to do this, but Adolf ignored her and claimed that this was bound to happen to someone eventually. He then turned back to Hugo, asking him to grant him the opportunity to have a conversation with Vikir. Hugo reluctantly agreed, saying that if Adolf was that adamant, he could have his chance to have a deeper conversation with the child. But it turned out that this deeper conversation wasn't a talk, but a duel. Vikir and Adolf stood facing each other in an arena while Hugo and Camus watched from the sidelines. Adolf announced that he would be testing Vikir's abilities and instructed him to show everything he was capable of. Vikir agreed, but thought to himself that if he showed everything, Adolf might pass out. Adolf then casted a spell and started creating a pot. Camus explained that his uncle was making a pot using fire, earth, and water magic simultaneously with perfect control, which was typical of her powerful uncle. Adolf then filled the pot with water and placed the pot on his own head and challenged Vikir to a duel. He instructed Vikir that if he could make a single drop of water fall from the pot, it would be considered a victory. Vikir observed the pot and thought about how challenging an opponent like Adolf would be a great experience, and thought about his own win rate against Adolf prior to his regression. Vikir analyzed the situation and calculated that an assassination attempt would have a 50% chance of success and a 10% win rate if he were to face Adolf head-on. Vikir decided to approach the situation carefully, knowing that he only needed to do enough to satisfy Hugo's expectations, and also, he wanted to see what Adolf was truly capable of. Without warning, Vikir charged at Adolf with his sword in hand, running in a straight line towards him. Camus, who was watching from the side, couldn't believe what she was seeing. She shouted at Vikir, telling him that he couldn't run straight towards Adolf. As Vikir's sword came crashing down towards Adolf, he cast a barrier spell, blocking the attack. Adolf was amused at Vikir's attempt and questioned Camus as to why she was helping Vikir, while saying that shield magic was best used against swordsmen. Adolf knew that it would be difficult for Vikir to pierce through with most aura swords. Vikir was frustrated with the failed attack and clicked his tongue in annoyance. Adolf decided to take the offensive and started casting spells towards Vikir. Vikir, being nimble and quick, started dodging the spells effortlessly. Camus interjected, exclaiming that it was unfair as Adolf never used this level of magic against her in their duels. Adolf was taken aback by Camus's support of Vikir and asked her whose side she was on. He then turned to Vikir with a crying face, calling him a bastard and promising not to forgive him. Hugo watched the battle unfold, analyzing the two combatants. He noted that Vikir was attacking at a speed that was difficult but not impossible to dodge, and decided there was no need to intervene. He wanted to see what Vikir was capable of, and show the old man what a young hound could do. As Vikir dodged Adolf's spells, he analyzed his opponent's abilities. He knew that he could use his knowledge from before his regression and his current age to gain an advantage. Adolf smirked at Vikir, claiming that his sword would never pierce through his shield. However, Vikir's attacks began to break the shield, catching Adolf off guard. Adolf noticed that Vikir was attacking at the same point on the shield with his sword and was impressed by Vikir's machine-like movements and swordsmanship. As Vikir was attacking with his sword, it suddenly broke into pieces, causing Adolf to smirk and taunt him about his lack of consideration for the durability of his sword and the strength of his shield. However, Hugo and Camus, who were watching from the sidelines, had shocked expressions on their faces. Adolf continued to speak, unaware of the surprised reactions of those around him. Suddenly, water started pouring on his face, completely covering his head in a matter of seconds. Adolf shouted in surprise, wondering how a piece of the broken sword had managed to pierce the pot and drench him with water. Vikir, with a smile on his face, commented that the pot seemed to be full. Camus, who witnessed the unexpected turn of events, blushed and exclaimed in disbelief that Vikir had won against her uncle and started thinking about the possibility of marriage. Meanwhile, Hugo, who was standing beside Camus, realized that the incident with the broken sword was not just a coincidence, but a sign of Vikir's exceptional talent and strength. He couldn't help but wonder if he was raising a much stronger hound than he had initially anticipated. 7 years had passed since the young hounds first stepped foot in the Baskerville training grounds. Today, they faced a fierce monster that resembled a bear with horns. As the monster charged at them, the young hounds attacked it with their swords, one after another. Watching from the sidelines was Baskerville clan shadow hound Staffordshire Baskerville, the instructor of the young hounds. He knew that facing opponents stronger than them was a daunting task, so he shouted out instructions to the young hounds, telling them to aim for the hind leg to slow down the monster instead of targeting the vital points from the beginning. The triplets among the young hounds coordinated their strikes, leaving the monster exhausted. Staffordshire was impressed and thought to himself that their dark crimson aura was very suitable for the Baskervilles. After the triplets had weakened the monster, the other young hounds resumed their attacks and finished it off. Staffordshire applauded the young hounds and congratulated them on becoming low-rank sword experts and masters of the first Baskerville technique. Staffordshire reminded the young hounds that they were facing a caged monster and that the wild ox bear on Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain would be quite different. He warned them that death could occur much more easily than they thought, and they must use their bloodline to overcome it or build their experience to survive somehow. With that, the instructor concluded the 7-year training and congratulated the young hounds on their graduation. He wished them good luck in their future endeavors. After the successful completion of their training, the young hounds started chatting among themselves. 2 hounds were discussing their preferences for the various night orders within the Baskerville clan. The first hound mentioned that he preferred the wolfhound order, while the second hound shared his choices: Doberman, Pitbull, and Rottweiler. There were 7 night orders in the Baskerville clan, each established and managed for various objectives, such as watching, searching, guarding, assassinating, suppressing, and all-out warfare. Suddenly, the first hound asked his companion where he thought that bastard would go. The second hound asked in confusion who was he referring to. The first hound clarified that he was referring to the person sitting on the dead ox bear, who was none other than Vikir. They continued their conversation about Vikir, with one hound saying that Vikir had defeated a much larger ox bear than the one they had just faced, and that he was already a high-rank sword expert at the 3rd Baskerville technique, which meant that he was at the shadow hound's level. Vikir sat on the dead ox bear, lost in thought. He knew it had taken longer than he had anticipated to reach his current level, which was graduate intermediate rank at the 5th Baskerville technique. While his swordsmanship had improved greatly, he felt his growth was much slower than he had hoped for. Suddenly, head butler Barrymore appeared behind Vikir and addressed him as Master Vikir. The butler informed Vikir that the patriarch was looking for him and that his assignment had been decided. Vikir, with a serious expression on his face, replied with a simple, "All right." Vikir entered the patriarch's office and greeted Hugo. However, he only received a grunt in response. Vikir noticed a cut on Hugo's nose and asked him what had happened. Hugo replied that he had been subjugating barbarians on Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain, and that one of the archers had gotten the better of him. Vikir asked if he had captured them, but Hugo replied that he had not. However, he did manage to give the archer the same scar on her face. After a moment of silence, Hugo congratulated Vikir on graduating. However, his tone was ominous when he added that it was only going to get harder. Vikir wondered if Hugo was going to talk about the assignment now, as he reminisced about his past before his regression. He had been a junior knight of the Pitbull Order, and was sent to the treacherous Le Rouge et Le Noir mountain to face death non-stop for 21 months. He had been like an expendable mutt, immediately dispatched into battle upon his arrival. He remembered that the Baskerville children were categorized as either elite or expendable once they reached the age of 15. The expendables were sent to die in battle, while the elite were educated about politics and administration. Through numerous brushes with death, the experienced expendables eventually became guards to the elite, while the elite matured over time through practicing politics and administration. Vikir knew that the fifth Baskerville technique existed to let the elite catch up to the expendables' long hours and experiences with real-life battles. However, his swordsmanship had not been able to surpass the fourth technique prior to his regression. There was no way that Hugo, the one in charge, would let him, an illegitimate child, take a course for the elite. Vikir's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Hugo. Hugo suggested that Vikir should try the lower house of parliament. Not fully understanding what Hugo meant, Vikir asked for clarification. Hugo explained that the lower house of parliament assisted the Baskerville clan's regional administration, legislature, and law enforcement, as well as inviting businesses and looking after the region as necessary. Simply put, they managed both small and large matters of the clan. Vikir was surprised that Hugo had selected him, an illegitimate child, to take the elite course. Hugo continued, saying that Vikir's achievements were greater than any child who was referred to as a genius by 10 years, so he would treat Vikir as such. The position that Vikir would be taking was the deputy consul of the underdog city. Currently, both the consul and deputy consul positions were vacant. Hugo asked Vikir if he would like to try it. After considering Hugo's proposal, Vikir decided to accept the position of deputy consul of the underdog city. However, before proceeding, he wanted to discuss an incident involving the Morgue clan and the Ruby Mines. Hugo seemed to know about it already, and referred to how Vikir screwed over Adolf Morgue. Vikir confirmed this and asked if he could borrow his reward once. Even though what Vikir wanted to borrow was still not revealed yet, the head butler who had an idea about it was shocked at Vikir's bold request, but Hugo didn't seem to mind. He stamped a paper and assured Vikir that he trusted him not to do anything foolish. With confidence, Vikir promised he wouldn't make Hugo worry, but he couldn't help but think how strange it was to be called son by Hugo, something that would have been unimaginable before his regression. As head butler and Vikir walked down the hallway, the head butler spoke in a serious tone. He emphasized the patriarch's high regard for Vikir, as evidenced by his appointment as a consul prior to being dispatched into battle. The head butler referred to this as the disciplines of kingship, suggesting that Vikir was being groomed for greater responsibilities in the future. However, Vikir was not complacent about his new role. He acknowledged that success was not guaranteed, and that he would have to work hard to manage his responsibilities as deputy consul. Vikir thought to himself that this was an opportunity for him to hone his skills more safely. He wasn't particularly interested in current events, but his memories from his previous life were still vivid. He remembered the sensation of his head being severed from his body by the guillotine. Vikir decided at that moment that he will let Hugo le Baskerville feel the same sensation. In the Baskerville territory, underdog. In a large villa, a bald man gave orders to 2 workers, instructing them to ensure that the place is perfectly clean by the next day, as a new deputy consul from the Baskerville family was coming. The workers acknowledged his orders and said, "Yes, sir." Later on, one of the workers wondered what kind of person the new deputy consul would be and hoped that he would have experience in business. However, the other worker told him that the new deputy consul was only 15 years old. While they were talking, a young boy was approaching the villa, and the second worker noticed him. He placed his hand on the kid's shoulder and wondered whose child he was and if any employee had brought him. The worker then told the boy that he couldn't just enter the villa freely. It turned out, the young boy who had approached the villa was none other than Vikir. With an angry look on his face, he ordered the worker to remove his hand from his shoulder. Then he pulled out a paper and showed it to the worker, who was surprised to see that it was the document verifying Vikir's position as the new deputy consul. The workers were confused as to why he had come a day early, but Vikir was not concerned about that. He ordered the workers to prepare food and drinks for a party he was going to have. As Vikir entered the villa, both workers had questioning looks on their faces, and wondered why the new deputy consul was planning a party. Soon, the party began, and the whole villa was filled with food and drinks. Many nobles were in attendance, enjoying the festivities and talking with one another. Chihuahua Baskerville, the general secretary of the city of Underdog, was pacing back and forth in his office, clearly agitated. He looked out the window and couldn't believe what he saw. The new deputy consul, a young man who had just started working for the city, was holding a party at the workplace. Chihuahua was already having a hard time because all of his predecessors had been dismissed for accepting bribes. And now, this guy was drinking and partying on the job. Chihuahua couldn't believe the audacity of this troublemaker. As he was about to express his frustration, Vikir suddenly appeared behind him and asked if he was the general secretary. The sudden interruption startled him and he almost jumped out of his skin. He was surprised to see Vikir and wondered how long he had been standing there. Vikir introduced himself as Vikir van Baskerville. The new deputy consul, and Chihuahua introduced himself as Chihuahua Baskerville. Vikir repeated Chihuahua's name, noting that he didn't have a middle name. Chihuahua thought to himself that it was going to happen again. He knew that a lack of a middle name signified that he was from outside the family and that he was employed rather than a blood member of the family. Chihuahua had to deal with discrimination from deputy consuls because of this. He was tired of being looked down upon and treated unfairly because he wasn't born into the family. But Chihuahua was surprised by Vikir's response. Instead of mocking him, Vikir placed his hand on Chihuahua's shoulder and simply said, "Nice." This threw Chihuahua off guard, and he responded with a confused look. Vikir went on to explain that he had scanned through Chihuahua's personal information on the way there and had noticed that Chihuahua was from Underdog. Chihuahua agreed with him, saying that he was born and raised in the current place they were in. Vikir acknowledged this and mentioned that he knew how hard people like Chihuahua had to work and that he didn't intend to interfere with how Chihuahua did his job. Chihuahua was still a bit confused but responded with an awkward, "Okay." Chihuahua couldn't help but think that, was this some new form of harassment? And wondered why Vikir was even there in the first place when he was the one who asked for the party. But Vikir continued, mentioning that while the personal law system itself didn't have a problem, there were many strange things about the judicial system. Vikir continued speaking, explaining that the problem with Underdog was that many illegal business owners were successful, and as a result, the underground held the power above the law. Simply stopping the illegal businesses wouldn't resolve the problem. The heads of the underground businesses needed to be removed. As a deputy consul, his job was to make laws and execute them, and while he respected all the laws that were already in place, he intended to add a new one. Chihuahua exclaimed in surprise as he heard the word "new law." Vikir nodded and explained that he would make sure the underground economy was in shambles within a week. However, he needed a cause in order to make and execute this law. Chihuahua couldn't understand why Vikir needed a cause for getting rid of illegal businesses. Vikir explained that he was still young and a newly appointed deputy consul. He needed a performance in order to make it more convincing. Chihuahua still didn't fully understand Vikir's plan. Vikir looked out of window as his expression turned into an evil grin, and he said that, "To put it differently, I will lay out poop for the flies." Chihuahua couldn't help but wonder what Vikir was planning. The next day, Vikir arrived at Doorsmile Street in downtown Underdog. A huge crowd had already gathered there and people were chatting among themselves. Vikir stood on the stage with a stake in his hand. Chihuahua and his companions wondered what the deputy consul was planning to do. They commented that there were a lot of people there, and that the deputy consul had been standing there since the crack of dawn. Suddenly, Vikir stepped forward and announced that he was the newly appointed deputy consul. The crowd was surprised to see such a young man as the deputy consul and wondered what he was going to do. Some of them murmured that he was cute while some questioned what a young man like him could do. Vikir ignored the crowd and said, "I believe you have all seen this notice. These are laws that have been in place for a while. Even if the deputy consul has changed, the Baskerville family's laws are still strict as before and will continue to be upheld." However, the crowd did not seem to have any faith in Vikir's words. They muttered among themselves, questioning his ability to carry out laws at such a young age. Some even commented on the corruption of the higher-ups and thought that Vikir would soon fall victim to it. Chihuahua, who stood by Vikir's side, could no longer remain silent. He shouted at the crowd, demanding that they show respect to the new deputy consul. The crowd fell silent, but some still doubted Vikir's ability to uphold the laws. and they thought that Chihuahua might be a better choice for the position of deputy consul. Suddenly, Vikir's actions had the entire crowd in a state of shock. As he pulled up the stake, whole crowd fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on him. With immense power, Vikir then plunged the stake into the ground with such force that the earth around it seemed to shake. The crowd could hardly believe what they were seeing. They were amazed at the sheer strength that Vikir had displayed. But then, Vikir announced something that took everyone by surprise. He said that he would announce a special law, with his authority as a deputy consul known as the Vikir Special Law, which would award 100 million gold to anyone who could remove the stake from the ground. The entire crowd looked at Vikir and the stake in disbelief, trying to analyze what was happening. Suddenly, the crowd erupted into a loud chorus of disbelief, shouting, 100 million. As the crowd gathered around him, Deputy Consul Vikir van Baskerville announced his new laws. The first law, known as the Vikir Special Law, Paragraph 1, Article 1, stipulated that whoever pulled out an appointed stake, henceforth referred to as the stake, would be paid 100,000 gold immediately by Vikir himself. The crowd was stunned by the announcement and exclaimed in shock. They couldn't believe that they could get such a huge amount of money just by pulling out a stake. One person in the crowd asked if it was really that easy, and everyone murmured about it in disbelief. Despite the excitement, nobody came forward to pull out the stake. Vikir saw that no one was willing to take the risk, so he asked if there was no one who wanted to get 100,000 gold. When no one stepped forward, Vikir declared a new law. The Vikir Special Law, Paragraph 1, Article 2, stated that the person who pulled out this stake would be paid 1,000 gold immediately by Vikir himself. This time, the offer was too tempting to resist. Suddenly, Vikir heard someone laugh, and he saw a fat old man in the crowd with an angry voice. The man exclaimed that it was ridiculous and asked if Vikir was making fun of them. He questioned who would attempt it, and the crowd began to murmur in agreement. But someone in the crowd pointed out that 1,000 gold was not chump change, and the mood shifted slightly. General Secretary Chihuahua, who was on stage behind Vikir, wondered why they were getting embarrassed instead. But Vikir ignored all the comments and asked if there was no one willing to take the challenge. With no one stepping forward, Vikir surprised the crowd once again by declaring a new law. This time, the reward was even higher, 10,000 gold. The crowd was stunned by the offer, and Vikir confidently stated that the person who pulled out the stake would be rewarded with the sum. As Vikir repeated his offer, the crowd was in a state of shock and confusion. Some wondered if it was all just a joke, while others were tempted to try their luck. However, others warned them of the potential consequences, saying that just look at the sword on his waist and the potential danger of being perceived as greedy by the deputy consul. Despite Vikir's repeated offers, no one came forward to pull the stake. As he was about to speak again, he was interrupted by Chihuahua, who whispered to him that there was not enough money in the city to fulfill his offer. Suddenly, a small hand shot up from within the crowd. The hand belonged to a little girl who had a flower basket on her other hand. She timidly asked if she could try. The crowd was shocked that this little girl was trying to pull out the stake from the ground. An old man recognized her as Judy, the flower girl, and tried to stop her, but Judy explained that her mother was sick and she had to try something. Despite the old man's warnings, Judy approached the stake and stood in front of it. She looked at the man behind the stake with fear and hesitation. Judy thought to herself, hoping to calm her nerves. She wondered if she would receive any payment for this act of bravado. She had volunteered to pull out the stake, hoping to earn a few coins for her efforts. She was hoped that at least she would be able to sell the basket full of flowers she had brought with her to the event. Without a word, Vikir simply said, "Pull it out." His voice was devoid of emotion, and Judy couldn't tell if he was angry or bored. She took a deep breath, grabbed the stake with both hands, and pulled with all her might. To her surprise, the stake came out of the ground easily, as if it had never been stuck there in the first place. The crowd gasped in shock and disbelief, staring at Judy in amazement. They couldn't believe that such a small and frail girl had managed to pull out the stake so effortlessly. Judy looked at Vikir, who had been watching her intently, with the stake in her hand. Judy wondered if she had done something wrong, as Vikir made a motion as if he was about to pull out his sword. Her heart sank as she closed her eyes in fear, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She thought of her mother and wondered who would take care of her after she was gone. but instead of the sword, a hand with a bag appeared in front of her. As Judy opened her eyes, she saw Vikir on one knee, holding a bag filled with gold. Vikir, while giving the bag to Judy, said that, "For now, here is 100,000 gold." Judy stood there, still in shock, holding the bag of gold tightly in her hand. Vikir looked at her and asked her where her home was, since 10,000 gold will be heavy, so he will have it shipped to her home. Vikir even provided her with a guard to protect her reward. Judy couldn't believe what she was hearing. Vikir then placed his hand on her head and said, "This is the law. It must always be obeyed." The crowd behind them was equally stunned, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Even Chihuahua, who had been watching the scene, let his mouth hung open. No one had expected Vikir to actually follow through with his promise to reward the person who managed to pull out the stake from the ground. The performance was a significant turning point, as it allowed the Vikir special law to become more famous than the self-governance law of the Baskerville clan. The citizens were touched by the simple logic of being rewarded for obeying the law and punished for disobeying it. People were discussing the new deputy consul, who was vastly different from his predecessors. Vikir was known for keeping his word no matter what, which earned him a great deal of respect from the people. The society in which principles were upheld was something to be admired, and the implementation of the Vikir special law led to a noticeable decrease in unlawfulness and a halving of crime rates. Chihuahua had just finished writing something on a board in the deputy office when Vikir noticed and asked if it was written in the Eastern language. Vikir complimented Chihuahua on his handwriting, and Chihuahua expressed his admiration for Vikir's daring performance that left him touched for the first time after 20 years of working there. Vikir explained that ruling citizens with wrath when they belittle the law and do not trust it is not the way to go. He shared how he thought hard about how to get the attention of the citizens and leave a lasting impression, and that was the result. Chihuahua was moved to tears and pledged to follow Vikir for the rest of his days. Vikir tried to calm Chihuahua down. Vikir's mind wandered as he thought about the recent performance he had orchestrated. He couldn't help but compare it to the one that Camus Morgue would have presented years from now. While Camus had managed to reduce the crime rate to 1%, but she was never really liked by the citizens due to the fear she instilled in them. Looking down at the map on the table, Vikir noted that the problems were only just beginning, since the reward of 10,000 gold had been used, and they needed to find a way to get it back. After marking some locations on the map, he explained that the locations marked on the map were where there were potential illegal groups, or where they may hide in the future. Vikir was determined to maintain these locations and confiscate their dirty money. Chihuahua looked at the map in surprise and asked Vikir how he knew where the criminal businesses were located. Vikir pointed to his nose and claimed that he could smell them. In reality, he had already surveyed those regions before his regression and knew them like the back of his hand. Chihuahua was impressed by Vikir's flawless investigation skills and wondered just how much he had already investigated. Suddenly, a staff member burst into the room, interrupting the conversation between Chihuahua and Vikir. The staff member addressed Deputy Consul Vikir, informing him that the Village Hall's Youth Autonomy Association had requested a meeting. Chihuahua, seemingly unsurprised by the news, commented that it was probably time for such a meeting to take place. Vikir, on the other hand, referred to them as arrogant bastards and questioned why they would want to see him. Chihuahua proceeded to inform Vikir that the Youth Autonomy Association was made up of various clans, including the Mant Blanc, Pior, Luovi, Channel, Faragamu, Hermes, and Pradar clans. He explained that the organization was founded by the second and third generations of the 7 native families of Baskerville. Chihuahua went on to describe the Youth Autonomy Association as a promiscuous social club, despite its name suggesting otherwise. He speculated that the young masters of the group likely had something to say about the Vikir special law. Vikir said in a questioning tone, "The dung flies have started to smell the shit?" This statement surprised both Chihuahua and the staff member. Vikir smirked and suggested that they should start annihilating the pests that are eating away the city. Deep within the burning suspension, a high-end club located within the underdog city's most luxurious hotel, a party was taking place. The VIP lounge, which had been rented out for a whopping 10 million gold for a 6-hour rental service, was filled with the 7 crucial members of the Youth Autonomy Association. These members were the second and third generation children of the 7 families located within the Baskerville territory, a powerful and influential area within the city. The atmosphere was lively as the members of the association were making a tower with glasses and pouring drinks on them. They boasted about the price tag of each bottle as they continued to build the tower, which had a pyramid shape. The blonde guy in the club turned to the waiters and instructed them to drink the spilled wine on the table. The waiters obediently lapped it up like dogs, thanking him for the opportunity to enjoy such a precious drink. As he sat down on a sofa, he boasted about his wealth, remarking that no matter how much he spent, his money always replenished itself. One of the blonde guy's companions attributed it all to the Baskervilles, who only cared about territorial expansion and not about the demand for slaves. He remarked that it was easy to kidnap barbarians and sell them as slaves, thanks to the Baskervilles. The companions agreed that this was all thanks to the Baskervilles, and that it was great because they didn't have to worry about the imperial family, decided to massacre them personally. As the group continued to talk, one of the companions mentioned a new deputy consul named Vikir, who was of Van descent. The blonde guy questioned if anyone had heard of him before, and when they replied no, he suggested that they teach the young government worker a lesson. The plan was to invite him to a party with the best drinks and women, and once the party was over, they would force him to pay for it. The blonde guy was confident that the 15-year-old wouldn't be able to report them since he wouldn't have any money. The companions agreed, and the group laughed at the thought of their impending prank. As they were discussing their plan, a waiter entered the room with some girls, announcing their arrival. The blonde guy and his companions looked up excitedly, eager to enjoy their evening with the ladies. One of the guys noticed a young male accompanying the ladies and questioned his presence. The waiter was unaware of who he was and answered that he entered with such confidence that nobody questioned him. The young male was none other than Vikir. The waiter grabbed Vikir by his hair and, in an angry tone, demanded to know why he was there. However, Vikir's eyes glowed with anger, and suddenly the room fell silent as the group had shocked expression on their faces. As Vikir approached the group, the waiter noticed that his arm was bent at an impossible angle, causing him to shout in pain. One of the guys who had initially pointed out Vikir expressed his surprise at the sight. Vikir introduced himself as Vikir van Baskerville, and the guy repeated his name and recognized him as the deputy consul and questioned why he was there. Vikir simply replied that they have invited him here. The blonde guy realized that the situation was getting out of hand and tried to calm down the situation and exclaimed with laughter, saying that it was amazing that he had come to the party. Vikir watched the blonde guy whisper with one of his companions, discussing something. The blonde guy asked if they should enact their plans, and his companion agreed, suggesting they see how Vikir deals with paying for everything. The blonde guy agreed and suggested they keep Vikir there and force him to pay once the party was over. Vikir couldn't take it any longer. He placed his hand on the table, interrupting their conversation, and demanded that they stop the pointless chatter. Suddenly, the whole table exploded, and glasses filled with drinks crashed to the floor, causing the people in the room to look on in surprise. As the drinks fell down, the blonde guy watched in disbelief as the table exploded, and his thoughts immediately went to Vikir's potential abilities. He thought, could he have used mana manipulation to make the champagne tower explode just by touching the table? The blonde guy realized that Vikir was a graduator. The blonde guy's companion was equally shocked and whispered in anger that they had thought Vikir was just a 15-year-old kid. The blonde guy snapped back, telling his companion that they were a middle-class expert and should do something. But the companion was too scared, knowing that they would lose in an instant if they tried to fight Vikir. Suddenly, Vikir placed his hand on one of the guy's shoulders and addressed him directly. The guy was so scared that he blurted out that they were going to pay for the drinks. Vikir questioned whether they were planning on forcing him to pay for everything, and the guy realized that he had made a huge mistake. Another companion spoke up, asking who would dare do such a thing. The blonde guy tried to calm the situation, saying that they only wanted to test Vikir as Underdog City had become corrupt. They wanted to ensure that Vikir wouldn't be enticed by the city's offers. The blonde guy's companion agreed, saying that it seemed like Vikir had what it takes to lead them, and they would be sure to follow. Vikir suddenly attacked the guy sitting closest to him with a palm strike that was more like a claw attack. He clutched the guy's stomach tightly and delivered a stern message. An owner can test their dog, but a dog should never test their owner, no matter the situation. As he looked at the rest of the group, Vikir questioned whether they were unmoved by his actions because they had money and power. He warned them that they had never seen anything truly frightening before. Vikir threw the guy he had been holding to the ground and stepped on his face. He then looked at the rest of the group and asked if they knew why he had done this. If they didn't, it seemed like they would meet the same fate. The blonde guy's face was stricken with fear as he stuttered out a response, saying that they were well aware of why Vikir had taken such actions. But Vikir kicked the man's head on which he was stepping on and told them that if they really knew, they would understand what he would do next. The group became angry seeing this, and blonde guy called Vikir a bastard, while another questioned if he thought he could get away with it. Suddenly, Vikir appeared right in front of the second guy and accused the group of committing crimes such as abduction, kidnapping, illegal slave trafficking, and insulting Baskerville. The rest of the group had a shocked expression hearing Vikir mention the crimes that they had done. Vikir then punched the second guy and told them that animals don't learn until you teach them. Vikir's face turned into an evil grin as he said that now he was prepared to teach the disobedient creatures a lesson. In a dimly lit prison cell, two men stood with contrasting expressions. Vikir, the deputy consul, appeared unfazed while Chihuahua, the general secretary, looked on with a mix of shock and concern. Before them stood a blond man with a beaten-up face, who was screaming and shouting at them, calling them all sorts of names. The man continued to yell, accusing Vikir of pulling some kind of stunt that would result in his father retaliating against them. He threatened to kill both of them once he was released, promising never to forgive them for what they had done. Chihuahua was visibly distressed by the situation and turned to Vikir, asking why the man had been beaten so brutally. Vikir asked if he thought he had overdone it, to which Chihuahua responded with a resounding yes. He expressed his disbelief that anyone could inflict such serious injuries on another human being, comparing the victim to a meat bag. But Vikir didn't seem to care. He walked towards the cell with a cold smile on his face, assuring Chihuahua that he hadn't even started yet. Chihuahua, on the other hand, looked shocked and disbelieving. He asked Vikir what he was planning to do, to which Vikir replied that he was going to execute all the wicked civil servants who had mutated into a hideous organization. He claimed that he could tell from their arrogant expressions that they lacked proper education, and that they had even overlooked the authority of the Baskerville clan. Chihuahua still couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked Vikir if he was serious, to which Vikir replied in the affirmative. The blonde guy and his companions were now begging for their lives, promising to give Vikir everything they had if he spared them. Chihuahua then voiced his concern about the repercussions of Vikir's actions. He asked him if he was aware that the families of the executed men would not just sit idly by. They were cowardly, yet daring, and they would use whatever methods possible to avenge their loved ones. Vikir's confident smile remained as he reassured Chihuahua that there was no need to worry about the families of the executed men. He claimed that these corrupt officials were tied to the criminal organizations of Underdog City, and that their families would not be able to complain. Chihuahua, however, seemed to be concerned about the evidence against these officials, to which Vikir replied that he had his ways of finding evidence. He thought to himself that if he couldn't find any evidence, he would make his own. Vikir didn't seem to care about the events that would take place after this. He believed that the world was soon going to experience a sudden change, and he would most likely be dispatched into battle very soon. Even if that wasn't the case, he knew that he would have to leave this place once he enrolled at the academy. Vikir stood in front of the prisoners, his eyes cold and unfeeling as he gazed at them. Vikir listed out their crimes, his voice flat and monotone. Human trafficking, kidnapping, bribery, blackmail, threatening, assault through a third party, and murder. The blonde guy immediately denied their involvement in any of those crimes and asked for evidence. However, Vikir just smirked and asked if they would accept punishment if there was evidence. After hearing this, the blonde guy looked down, his guilt written all over his face. It was like he was saying, "I'll never cause damage to the family, even if I were to die here." Suddenly, a man appeared to be walking towards him, carrying a bag. The man had a bald head called out to Vikir. Vikir turned around, not surprised to see the man there. The bald guy placed the bag in front of Vikir and informed him that his custom order was ready. Vikir expressed his gratitude for the timely delivery of his order, and the bald guy just chuckled in response. Vikir opened the bag to reveal an assortment of tools, which he arranged carefully on a cloth. As Vikir was setting up his tools, the bald guy suddenly spoke up, saying that he had never seen some of these tools before, despite having been torturing people for 30 years. He asked Vikir how he had come up with such scary tools. Vikir shrugged and replied that he didn't invent them himself. They were common where he came from. The bald guy was taken aback and asked if Vikir had come from hell. Vikir just chuckled and said that it was something like that. And then he asked the bald guy if he would like to learn it. The bald guy quickly declined, saying that he might vomit everything he had eaten if he saw Vikir work with those tools. Vikir just nodded and looked at his tools, lost in thought. He missed the days of the era of destruction when even the demon clan's prisoners of war would spit out everything during torture. By torturing the demon clan, the torturing methods had evolved significantly. Vikir opened his coat and revealed his tools, causing the blond guy to squeal in fear. Vikir looked at the prisoners and asked where their expressions were from before when they had claimed they wouldn't admit to anything no matter what. He then tied the buttons on his wrist and said, "Please, don't say anything. I want to cherish the memories of my past for once." The blond guy couldn't hold back the flood of tears that streamed down his face. Rumors of the arrest of the 7 wicked gangs quickly spread throughout Underdog City. As long as there was a gathering of more than 3 citizens, that rumor continued to circulate. In a nearby tavern, patrons were discussing the incident. One of them expressed relief that the arrested gangs were the ones who treated civilians like pests. Another patron doubted that the new deputy consul would release them anytime soon, considering their history. A third person chimed in, noting that the 7 arrested individuals were the second generation of native families, and that the deputy consul would likely just embarrass them before releasing them. However, another individual added that the charges against the 7 suggested that they may be executed. This sparked a conversation about whether the children of native families would really be put to death. One person claimed that the new deputy consul had a reputation for being ruthless, citing the fact that he had burned a 10 billion gold with one stake. Despite this, another person thought that executing the 7 individuals would put the deputy consul in a difficult situation. The citizens of Underdog City had believed that the arrest of the 7 notorious gang leaders was just a political power play between the new politician and the native authorities. They had predicted that once the local powerhouses bent their wills, the situation would be over, and the imprisoned gang members would be released unscathed. As expected, the Mant Blanc clan, Pior clan, Luovi clan, Channel clan, Ferragamu clan, Hermes clan, and the Pradar clan delivered an apology to the new deputy consul. But things didn't go as predicted. The 7 heads of the gang leaders were hung in the middle of the center square, preserved with salt, and displaying expressions of agony as if they had experienced excruciating pain until their last breaths. The public notice above the heads explained the punishments they received prior to their executions in detail. The Baskerville Family Autonomy Constitution was known for its strict laws and harsh punishments. The first clause was about the banning of illegal brothels. The penalty for this offense was a tattoo on the face of the criminal, with the symbol forceps being tattooed all over the face. The punishment was executed according to the governing law above. The second clause was about the banning of illegal gambling, and the penalty for this offense was wrist amputation. The punishment was carried out according to the law, with both wrists being amputated, taking into account the number of times the law was disobeyed. The criminal's wrists were amputated 72 times at regular intervals. The third clause was about the banning of illegal private loans, and the penalty for this offense was the removal of eyes. However, in consideration of the pleas of those who had been affected by these criminals, the punishment was not executed. The fourth and final clause was about the banning of illegal lobbying, and the penalty for this offense was exile. Since the criminals were already dead, their bodies, excluding their heads, were thrown outside the castle walls. The crowd was in shock as they read the notice and saw the scene in front of them. Vikir in his office explained that there was no reason to be surprised as the laws were already in place. However, this was the first time that the infamous native families would be serving the sentences. He believed that this would bring forth change, and that once the destruction of either parties began, Underdog City would go through a bloodbath. Vikir turned to Chihuahua and warned him to brace himself, as he would join him in the next strategy. Chihuahua was surprised and clearly taken aback by Vikir's words. The scene changes and Chihuahua was standing in the same pose with a mask on his face. Chihuahua turned back and whispered to the occupant inside the cage, who was none other than the deputy consul, asking if this was really the right strategy. Vikir simply asked Chihuahua if he didn't trust him. As Chihuahua stood there, the place began to fill up with people. They all wore masks to conceal their identities, and slaves were also being transported, their hands bound in iron handcuffs. Amidst the chaos, Chihuahua's thoughts turned to Vikir, who sat quietly in one of the slave cages. Chihuahua wondered if Deputy Consul being sold as a slave was a good strategy. The video ends here. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell to receive updates on my next videos quickly and not miss any new content.